Good morning. May I ask you to take your seats? So, distinguished delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will proceed with the review of the report of Zimbabwe in accordance with Resolution 5/1. The review will be based, as usually, on national report, on compilation report prepared by the Office of High Commissioner, based on UN sources, and summary of stakeholder information provided to the Office of High Commissioner and compiled by the Office of High Commissioner. I would like to welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe, and I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Emmerson Mnagawagwa, Vice President and Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs of Zimbabwe, to introduce the report. Mr. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Your Excellencies, members of the Troika, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for giving us the floor to present our national report. We acknowledge your leadership of the working group. It is my singular honor to present this statement on behalf of the government of Zimbabwe on this occasion of the second cycle of the Universal Periodic Report. Allow me at this outset to reiterate that the government of Zimbabwe is committed to the protection, promotion, and fulfillment of its human rights obligations. Zimbabwe is a proponent of the UPR process since its inception, and we appreciate the purpose within which it is premised. In that light, we continue to interact with the Human Rights Council and to participate in this forum. Mr. Vice President, in this regard, Zimbabwe hereby presents its national report on the progress made towards the implementation of the accepted 130 recommendations. Since the last review, a UPR National Steering Committee was established comprising of government and other stakeholder representatives. During the compilation of the national report, input was drawn from stakeholders including civil society organizations, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, government ministries, the labor market, the private sector, traditional leaders, parliament, independent commissions, and the United Nations country team. A national plan of action was adopted to guide and inform the implementation of the recommendations, with the National Steering Committee monitoring the process. Mr. Vice President, further to the above developments, a mid-term report was produced by the government of Zimbabwe in order to update the Human Rights Council on the progress made in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. Mr. Vice President, Zimbabwe is a landlocked country located in the southern part of Africa, where the effects of climate change in the region, especially the recent challenges caused by the El Nino phenomenon, have also adversely affected the government's implementation of social and economic rights, leaving our population vulnerable to famine. The negative impact of the current drought is putting pressure on the government to redirect resources from national social programs towards feeding our 800,000 vulnerable households. The continued imposition of economic sanctions by some Western countries has severely limited the fiscal space and economic growth. These sanctions have compounded the challenges faced by government in its effort to mobilize resources for the provision of social services, including education and health services, particularly in the rural areas. The absence of balance of payment support from the international financial institutions has forced the government to largely depend on resources mobilized from the domestic market. Mr. Vice President, that notwithstanding, government continues to put in place initiatives and policy parameters that ensure implementation of its social, economic, and cultural rights obligations. In order to promote these fundamental rights, government, among other initiatives, launched the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation in 2013, which is the government's major economic blueprint that is aimed at achieving sustainable and equitable economic and social development, propelled by the judicious and optimum utilization of the country's national resources. The government has gone further to adopt the monitoring and evaluation policy embedded in a results-based management matrix that makes our developmental efforts measurable. Zimbabwe Asset is implemented through a cluster system involving participation of line ministries, the private sector, civil society, and development partners. We are grateful that through several bilateral and multilateral arrangements, the government has been able to make good its domestic and international human rights obligations, especially on the socio-economic front. Mr. Vice President, furthermore, government embarked on the Easy of Doing Business project, which is being implemented in partnership with the World Bank. The object of the project is to improve Zimbabwe's international ranking as a sound investment destination by implementing various business reforms. To ensure food security in 2017 and beyond, at both household and national level, government, in partnership with the private sector, embarked on a special maize production program targeting to put 456,730 hectares of maize with the objective of producing 2,283,650 metric tons against a national requirement of 1.5 million metric tons for human consumption. To date, government has mobilized the resources amounting to United States dollars $294 million, of which 190 million US dollars is being directed towards supporting 110,000 hectares of irrigated maize crop and 340,000 hectares of dryland maize crop production, with expectation to produce at least 550,000 tons of maize. The balance of 54 million US dollars will be accessed by farmers through the banking sector. Mr. Vice President, since the previous review, Zimbabwe adopted a new constitution in 2013, which was overwhelmingly approved through a referendum. The constitution has been lauded for its substantive content that introduces silent fundamental democratic elements and an expanded Bill of Rights, incorporating all generations of rights. These rights can only be meaningful to our people through implementation of legislative and administrative measures to actualize the Constitution. In that vein, we embarked on a carefully crafted process of aligning the country's legislation with the Constitution. The government of Zimbabwe established the Inter-Ministerial Task Force on implementation of the Constitution that is spearheading the legislative alignment of our laws. This process entails reforming and revising policies, legislation, and general administrative practices in a manner that upholds the promotion and the protection of human rights. We have so far aligned more than 3/4 of the total pieces of legislation. We expect that by the end of our 5th session of the 8th Parliament in 2017, all laws will have been aligned to the Constitution. Mr. Vice President, the implementation of the Constitution for the realization of human rights has not been limited to alignment of legislation only. For example, the establishment of the Constitutional Court in 2013 has seen more human rights cases being referred and heard by the Constitutional Court. The courts have also adopted a strict human rights approach by applying international human rights law and leaning towards a wide and liberal approaches which uphold human rights. The courts are interpreting and assigning meaning to specific constitutional provisions requiring implementation, and human rights have received special attention. Recently, the Constitutional Court unequivocally ruled against child marriages on the basis of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, which sets the age of marriage at 18. Mr. Vice President, our Constitution obligates us to ensure that all international conventions, treaties, and agreements which we are party to are incorporated in domestic law. In keeping with that obligation, we designed and approved a ratification and domestication strategy which will accelerate our ratification and domestication process. During the period under review, the government of Zimbabwe has ratified the following human rights treaties: the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its optional protocol, the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which we have since domesticated and incorporated its provisions without change, the optional protocol to the UNCRC on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and the optional protocol to the UNCRC on the rights of the child, on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. Ratification of outstanding human rights treaties is still under consideration by government. Regarding periodic state-party reporting, a number of reports were presented on the following: United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that was 2012, African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, 2015, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, 2016. Mr. Vice President, I'm also pleased to highlight that the government of Zimbabwe has also approved and prioritized the programs that are aimed at facilitating the promotion of public awareness of human rights. This has been achieved through strategic and innovative constitutional and human rights advocacy meetings countrywide. Government has also promoted public awareness through radio programs and exhibitions at fairs across the country. This has largely enabled government to increase its promotion of constitutional and human rights awareness in all the 10 provinces of the country. During the period under review, government printed over 1 million copies of the Constitution, which include the A4 version of the Constitution in English, pocket-sized abridged versions in 8 languages, including the Braille version, while work on the remaining versions is still ongoing. 90% of these copies have been distributed. The Constitution can also be accessed on the government website. Allow me, Mr. Vice President, at this juncture, to highlight some of the achievements attained in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. These have been fully addressed in the national report, but of note is the establishment of a new independent commissions. Among other recommendations, we accepted to create and strengthen independent commissions which play a very important role of promoting and protecting the human rights in our country. The most important milestone that the government has achieved is the institutionalization of human rights promotion in the country through the establishment of the Human Rights Commission. The Commission is now fully operational, and the government remains committed to further strengthening it. Government has fully operationalized other independent commissions, such as the Zimbabwe Media Commission and the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, while the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has been further strengthened. Government is in the process of fully operationalizing the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, with commissioners already appointed. The enabling legislation is currently before Parliament. In conformity with international best practice and to ensure total independence, government through the Appropriation Act conferred financial autonomy to these commissions. Mr. Vice President, the promotion of equal access to justice for all remains one of government's key priority areas. This resonates well with our Zim asset philosophy. In light of this, government established 9 more resident magistrates courts in 6 provinces of the country, and construction of more courts is underway. In addition, legislation to designate all magistrates courts as small claims courts is before Parliament. Furthermore, in order to enhance access to justice and implement our obligation to provide legal representation to the indigent in terms of the Constitution, government has decentralized the legal aid program. Mr. Vice President, the national report before you highlights the achievements in respect of the following social and economic rights: right to shelter, right to education, right to health, and right to land. Suffice to say that the Constitution adequately provides for all these rights. May I reiterate that government is fully committed to ensure the fulfillment of these rights. Mr. Vice President, a number of member states have raised advanced questions and specific issues. We would like to thank member states for raising these issues, and allow me, Mr. Vice President, to take this opportunity to respond. In respect of the concerns raised by Belgium regarding early and forced marriages, as well as the steps taken by government to eliminate this practice, I would like to state that the Constitution of Zimbabwe sets 18 years as the age of majority, age of marriage. This position was confirmed by the Constitutional Court of Zimbabwe, as already alluded to in the national report. Following this landmark ruling on child marriages, government is harmonizing and aligning all marriage laws to the Constitution. The proposed marriage law will, among other things, prohibit early and forced marriages. Government has been prosecuting all perpetrators who commit sexual offenses against minors, and the proposed legislative framework will seek to criminalize early and forced marriages. Mr. Vice President, on the issue of increasing the registration of children in order to obtain official birth certificates raised by Mexico, as is indicated in our national report, government has opened 206 birth registration sub-offices in the districts in all the country's provinces, inclusive of all health institutions. In addition, schools also assist the pupils to obtain birth certificates. Mr. Vice President, in respect of the question from Mexico on measures that have been taken to secure access to food and education for all children, including children with disabilities, children in street situations, orphans, and children living in rural areas, the government has established drop-in centers in 5 major towns, where food is distributed for children living in the streets. Government has also set aside food for orphans, children in need of food in rural areas, and child-headed families. Community child care workers assist the government in distributing food and identifying orphans and children who are in need of education and other basic needs. Children with disabilities are given priority in receiving food. They are also allocated 10% of the government's educational assistance facility under the Basic Education Assistance module. Government has also embarked on the homegrown school feeding program for children in primary and secondary schools, which is being rolled out in phases starting with infant learners. Mr. Vice President, with regard to the question asked by Slovenia on what way the government is tackling the ever-increasing prevalence of HIV among the population, with the majority of new infections occurring among girls aged between 15 and 24, as well as the role the newly established National AIDS Trust Fund is playing in the area of prevention. Zimbabwe is among one of the few highly burdened countries which have demonstrated progress in decreasing HIV prevalence. Currently, the prevalence rate for HIV as of 2015 is around 13%. Government will undertake an antenatal care survey which will give new data on prevalence of HIV in 2017. Government has in place an elimination of mother-to-child transmission strategy for 2014 to 2018, which is in line with the Zimbabwe National HIV and AIDS Strategic Plan of 2014-2018. The EMTCT strategy is also aligned to the targets set out in Zimaset. This strategy aims to reach out to the pregnant and lactating women, with special emphasis on adolescent girls and young women. Government is making services accessible to all rural health facilities free of charge. Lifelong treatment is given to all HIV-positive pregnant and lactating women, with enhanced adherence among girls aged between 15 and 24 years. Again, government is committed to implement the 90-90-90 initiative, which speaks to identifying 90% of people living with HIV by 2020, and 90% of those who are on treatment, and 90% of those on treatment who are virally suppressed. For children, government is committed 95% by 2018 because of the fast track which will come with the new global framework on HIV prevention, care and treatment. It is worth noting that Zimbabwe is the current chair of the African Global Framework. Government will soon be launching and domesticating the global framework to HIV prevention, care and treatment. The National AIDS Trust Fund is being channeled towards prevention, community engagement and multi-sectoral approach to care and treatment. Mr. Vice President, on the question raised by Belgium regarding the concrete measures the government of Zimbabwe is taking to increase access to sexual and reproductive health services for women and unmarried adolescents, as recommended by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of Women and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. Government is committed to ensuring that sexual and reproductive health services to women and unmarried adolescents is accessible. Currently, government is reviewing the Medical Services Act, making deliberate efforts to make sexual reproductive health services and commodities available to adolescents and women. Government is also progressively establishing youth-friendly corners in health facilities where there is provision for services such as optimization of HIV prevention activities, HIV testing and treatment of those found positive, sexually transmitted infections, prevention and treatment, and counseling and information on voluntary male circumcision. Mr. Vice President, on the question raised by Slovenia regarding how the government is addressing a very high child abuse rate and the difficulties the victim face in accessing child-friendly services, Zimbabwe has a sufficient legal and structural framework which protects children from sexual abuse. The victim-friendly system is fully operational and has been decentralized as indicated in our national report. Mr. Vice President, concerns over completely abolishing the death penalty and ratifying the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights were raised by Switzerland, Czechia and Belgium. The 2013 Constitution of our country provides for the enactment of a law to impose the death penalty only on males aged between 21 and 70 years who are convicted of aggravated murder, contrary to the previous constitution, which had a wider range of offences under which, upon conviction, one could be sentenced to death, irrespective of gender. Zimbabwe notes that it accepted various recommendations during the previous review to ratify the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the abolition of the death penalty. During the consultative process of the drafting of our constitution, the majority of our people were in favor of the retention of the death penalty. As such, government could not ignore the wishes of the people who exercised their democratic right. Hence, the delay in the ratification of the above-mentioned optional protocol. Notwithstanding that, we are undertaking nationwide public awareness campaigns on the effects of the death penalty. Mr. Vice President, regarding the question on the steps taken by government to ratify and domesticate the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, and the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, raised by Germany, Sweden, Czechia, Netherlands, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, whilst the government is still considering the ratification of the Convention Against Torture, it is important to mention that most of the content in the Convention has been incorporated in our Constitution and domestic laws. Mr. President, sir, Spain has asked Zimbabwe to clarify the disappearance of Itai Dzamara. In response, we wish to state that isolated cases of disappearances have been reported previously. This is of major concern to government. Whenever such reports are brought to the attention of law enforcement agents, thorough investigations are carried out. In this particular case, government is investigating all the leads to establish the whereabouts of our citizen, and in this regard, government is working with the family of the missing person and the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. Mr. Vice President. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Vice President, we acknowledge the question of Switzerland on whether government will propose legislation to Parliament that will guarantee the independence of the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission and provide it with the necessary powers and resources to effectively discharge its constitutional mandate. I wish to state that the National Peace and Reconciliation Bill, which will operationalize the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, is set to be tabled before Parliament during the current session of Parliament. All independent commissions are now being funded directly from Treasury, as opposed to receiving their funds through line ministries. This indeed has strengthened the independence of the commissions and is in line with our Constitution and international best practice. Mr. Vice President, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has raised concerns regarding the independence and effectiveness of constitutional commissions. The Anti-Corruption Commission, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, given that in some cases the office of the President has assumed administration of commissions and the Human Rights Commission remains underfunded. The Constitution guarantees the independence of constitutional commissions. This is achieved through the deliberate strengthening of full operationalization of these institutions. Furthermore, the Constitution permits Vice Presidents to administer acts of Parliament upon assignment by the President. A stringent and transparent process of removing commissioners from office, similar to that prescribed for the removal of judges, guarantees their tenure of office. Mr. Vice President, in respect of the question raised by the United States of America regarding how the government will address the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission's lack of funds and independence in order to ensure that citizens are allowed free and equal participation in the upcoming elections. Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is independent and the government does not interfere with its operations. Government is supporting ZEC to discharge its mandate. Since the last review, a total amount of $185,913,549 United States dollars was extended to ZEC. This is despite our current economic challenges in the country. Mr. Vice President, concerning the questions submitted by Czechia, Mexico and Belgium pertaining to the legislative measures that have been adopted to guarantee all women the right to inherit or acquire land and other property. Prior to 2011, we already had in place a law to cater for the rights of women to inherit or acquire land and other property. This was a major departure from the previous colonial laws that rendered our women perpetual minors. The law provides for the rights of wives and daughters to inherit from their deceased husbands and fathers. Furthermore, the Constitution calls upon government to ensure full gender balance and to take measures to promote the full participation of women in all spheres, including land, on the basis of equality with men. In light of the above constitutional provision, women can now acquire land in their own right, and it is now mandatory policy that registration of land for spouses be done jointly. In addition, the law provides for the acquisition of property by women in similar circumstances to those afforded to their male counterparts. Mr. Vice President, regarding the steps taken to combat gender-based violence and ensure that the rights pertaining to women in the 2013 Constitution are transposed into legislation as raised by Sweden, I wish to state that in line with the Constitution, the Gender Commission was set up and operationalized through an Act of Parliament. Its mandate includes the monitoring of issues concerning gender equality and the investigation of cases of violations of rights relating to gender. Government is engendering the realignment of laws to provide for equal representation in all elective and non-elective boards, including government institutions. May I also highlight that prior to the enactment of the 2013 Constitution, Zimbabwe already had in place a legal framework to combat domestic violence. Mr. Vice President, concerns were also raised by the United States of America over the alleged reports that food meant for Zimbabweans most affected by the El Nino-induced drought is being distributed in partisan grounds, as well as the steps being taken to guarantee that the distribution of food and other aid is not being conducted in a discriminatory fashion. Firstly, I wish to reiterate that it is not government policy to distribute food on partisan lines. Government has adopted a zero-tolerance policy towards the politicization of food aid and has put in place stringent punitive measures against such practices, malpractices. To ensure transparency and fairness in the selection of beneficiaries, government assigned civil servants to distribute food. Mr. Vice President, I will address concerns raised by Switzerland regarding overcrowding and the poor conditions in prisons, as well as the measures the government will undertake to address these issues, including improvements in case management, the administration of justice, and the consideration of alternative sentencing. It must be noted that whenever the prison population exceeds the holding capacity, various interventions are implemented, including the transfer of inmates from closed prisons to spacious farm prisons. These measures are complemented by clemency orders, which are periodically issued by the President. In line with this constitutional mandate to align legislation with the Constitution, government is finalizing a new Prisons and Correctional Services Bill with provisions that are aimed at reducing congestion, improving prison conditions in line with international standards, among other pertinent issues. Other measures include creation of commodity correctional centers, as well as increasing the number of open correctional facilities. The imposition of non-custodial sentences, such as community service, is another measure aimed at addressing overcrowding within prisons. Government, with the assistance of some development partners, has put in place measures to improve the water supply and the water supply situation in prisons. Mr. Vice President, Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland have, among other silent issues, asked about what measures the government is taking to ensure that the laws on freedom of expression, opinion and the media, right to peaceful assembly and freedom of association, and the free and fair electoral process are promptly aligned to the Constitution and effectively implemented. As part of its strategy to expedite the alignment of laws to the Constitution, government established the Interministerial Task Force on Legislative Alignment, tasked with the responsibility of coordinating the alignment process of all laws, including those on freedom of expression and opinion of the media, right to peaceful assembly and freedom of association. This alignment process is still ongoing, and to date, 257 out of 396 acts of parliament have been aligned to the new constitution. Government prioritized the alignment of laws that affect fundamental human rights and freedoms by prioritizing crucial pieces of legislation which impact upon the enjoyment of human rights, including freedom of expression, opinion, and the media. The General Laws Amendment Act, in particular, has amended Part 4 of the Electoral Act in order to give the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, ZEC, the responsibility for registering voters, compiling voters' rolls and registers, and ensuring the proper custody and maintenance of the rolls. ZEC has since assumed these roles and has adopted a polling station-based biometric voter registration system. Registrations commencing in 2017 and the biometric voters roll will be used during the 2018 harmonized elections. Mr. Vice President, questions were raised by Sweden, Norway, Czechia, and the Netherlands on proposed steps taken to maintain and improve freedom of expression, including social media, media freedoms, and to ensure a more pluralistic media environment, as well as issuing broadcasting licenses for private broadcasters and community radios. Government is committed to an all-inclusive development agenda for the entire information and media sector in the country. This agenda entails a thorough review of all legislation governing the media industry in our country. As earlier alluded to, these laws, just like many others, are said to be reviewed under the ongoing national process of realigning all laws to the Constitution. Suffice to mention that the criminal defamation law is no longer part of our laws, as it was struck down by the Constitutional Court. Broadcasting licenses for private broadcasters and commercial radios were issued and are operational. Community radios licenses will be issued licenses for the digitalization of broadcasting services. Mr. Vice President, Norway raised a very pertinent question pertaining to what steps the government is taking to ensure that free and private exchange of information on social media platforms like WhatsApp is not unreasonably limited. The government is currently reforming the interception of communication laws, including the enactment of new laws such as the Computer and the Cyber Crimes Bill and the Data Protection Bill, so as to prevent unauthorized collection, processing, and transmission of personal data and interception of individuals' communications. In order to strike a balance between the state's role of crime prevention, maintenance of law and order, and the individual's rights to information and freedom of expression, the laws will require any interference with communications to be subjected to judicial authorization in line with international best practice. Mr. Vice President, concerning the question raised by the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland on measures the government of Zimbabwe intends to take to ensure that the constitutional right to freedom of assembly and free association is respected in the future, and the measures to roll back such restrictions. Government fully acknowledges its obligation to promote, protect, and fulfill the rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. However, these rights are not absolute and must be exercised peacefully and with due respect to the rights of others, as provided for in the Constitution. Hence, government will continue to ensure that such rights are enjoyed by all without causing any harm or prejudice to other people. Mr. Vice President, in respect of the question raised by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland regarding when the government of Zimbabwe will ensure that Its police force enforces court orders protecting the constitutional rights of citizens to shelter as per Section 71 of the Zimbabwean Constitution. I wish to clarify that in terms of our law, it is not the duty of the police to enforce civil court orders. This is the preserve of the Sheriff of the High Court, his deputy and assistants, including the messenger of court. However, the sheriff may enroll the assistants of the police when hindered from carrying out his or her duties, which ordinarily relate to the enforcement of court orders. Essentially, therefore, the police are called upon to ensure the maintenance of law and order. Mr. Vice President, on concerns raised by Germany, Norway and Czechia over increasing reports of human rights abuses by security forces against political and civil rights activists, including reports of abduction, arrest, torture, assault, harassment, and the denial of urgent medical attention, as well as the request for measures in place by government to ensure it upholds the rights enshrined in its constitution and holds security forces accountable for politically motivated violence. Government's position is that no one is above the law. Whenever a report is made, investigations are carried out, and no one is spared from prosecution, including members of the security forces. Victims of such acts can also institute civil litigation against the perpetrators. Our courts have a significant number of cases involving the security forces. Further, the government is in the process of crafting a law that will provide an independent complaints mechanism against members of the security forces in terms of the Constitution. The Act will provide an effective and independent mechanism for receiving complaints from members of the public, their investigation, and the provision of remedies for any harm caused by members of the security forces. Mr. Vice President, in respect of the recommendation to issue a standing invitation to special procedures and responding positively to the outstanding requests of special rapporteurs raised by Belgium and Czechia, Zimbabwe is committed to working with the special procedures regarding outstanding requests by certain special rapporteurs to visit Zimbabwe. Each request will be considered according to its merits. Mr. Vice President, I now stop here and I give back the floor to you, Your Excellency, to allow for the interactive dialogue with Member States. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you, Excellency, for your statement and the very exhaustive responses to questions raised by Member States in writing prior to the session. We shall now start interactive dialogue. 86 delegations have inscribed on the speakers list, so that allows us to give each delegation up to 1 minute 25 seconds to intervene. I would like to invite all delegations to respect this time limitation, and as is usual practice, the floor will be given to the next speaker as soon as 1:25 have elapsed. So with that in mind, I would like now to invite first delegation, and that is delegation of Netherlands, to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Netherlands would like to thank the Republic of Zimbabwe for its national report. We welcome commitments made by Zimbabwe during the previous UPR review in 2011 and look forward to a fruitful discussion on progress made in their implementation. We applaud Zimbabwe for adopting a new constitution in 2013, as it is founded on principles that include the rule of law and fundamental human rights. The Netherlands recommends Zimbabwe to: first, review and align the laws of Zimbabwe to the 2013 Constitution, including in relation to Section 61 on freedom of expression and freedom of media and to ensure their implementation. I thank the Minister for the statement concerning the ratification of the Convention against torture and other cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, and looking forward to the ratification by Zimbabwe. Ratify, third point, the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. The Netherlands deems the increase in the number of reported incidents infringing on the fundamental rights and freedom enshrined in Chapter 4 of the 2013 Constitution worrisome. These incidents include restriction on freedom of assembly and the right to peaceful demonstrate and petition. Media freedom and freedom of information have come under pressure with the arbitrary arrest of journalists. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands for his statement, and I call on the delegation of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. There have been encouraging developments in the strengthening of Zimbabwe's legislative framework, including the ratification of international human rights instruments. New Zealand recommends that Zimbabwe ratify the Convention Against Torture and the Second Optional Protocol for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We are concerned at the use of excessive force by government security forces, the rising number of political prisoners and arbitrary arrests of human rights defenders. New Zealand calls on Zimbabwe to ensure the right to freedom of expression is respected and to support an open political space. New Zealand recommends that the government repeal and amend legislation that infringes on these rights in line with Zimbabwe's international obligations and constitution, such as the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act and the Public Order and Security Act. We call on Zimbabwe to meet its international obligations and respect the Constitution, particularly in regard to the protection of political activists and journalists from harassment, arbitrary arrest and detention. New Zealand recommends that Zimbabwe ensure all individuals who have been detained and charged with an offence are given a fair and impartial trial, while ensuring the independence of the judiciary. New Zealand also recommends that Zimbabwe enhance social protection to ensure the delivery of food assistance and address malnutrition, and recommends the government allow the unimpeded ability of humanitarian agencies to deliver humanitarian assistance, including food aid, to all parts of the country. We wish the delegation a successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of New Zealand for the statement, and I call on the delegation of Niger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe to this second cycle and congratulate it on presenting its national report. We welcome the progress by Zimbabwe in promoting and protecting human rights, including the adoption in 2013 by referendum of a new constitution and very comprehensive declaration of rights. The new constitution, on the one hand, establishes new institutions, including the Constitutional Court, the Gender Equality Commission and the National Commission for Peace and Reconciliation. It also steps up the strength of institutions, including the Human Rights Commission of Zimbabwe and the Electoral Commission. We also note with satisfaction the strengthening of the legislative framework on human rights, including through the law on the Zimbabwean Commission Authority for Prosecutions, the Human Rights Commission, and the law amending labour law. We welcome the government's efforts in undertaking the socio-economic sustainable development program, transformation program to 2018, and in conclusion we recommend that Zimbabwe further strengthen its cooperation with human rights mechanisms, including the UN treaty bodies. Thank you. I thank the distinguished delegate of Niger for that statement, and I call on Nigeria.
Mr. Vice President, Nigeria welcomes Zimbabwe for their UPR presentations. We commend Zimbabwe for accepting majority of the recommendations during their last UPR cycle and acknowledge their national plan of action for the implementation of recommendations received. Zimbabwe has made tremendous effort in setting the legal and institutional framework for the protection and promotion of human rights through its constitutional provisions and ratification of many human rights treaties. Nigeria is encouraged by Zimbabwe's bold step on economic development through the launching of the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Economic Transformation 2013-2018, which meant to revive the economy and achieve sustainable economic development propelled by the judicious utilization of the country and human rights and natural resources. Mr. Vice President, Considering Zimbabwe's economic challenges caused by the imposition of the economic sanctions, which has hampered the implementation and realization of the human rights, especially socio-economic rights, we would like to make the following recommendation to Zimbabwe: to continue to mobilize resources and technical support to enhance the capacity to fulfill its human rights obligations. Finally, my delegation wishes Zimbabwe every success in its UPR process. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Nigeria for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Denmark warmly welcomes Zimbabwe's delegation and thanks it for its presentation today. Denmark commends Zimbabwe for the progress made since its last UPR, including by adopting the new constitution, improving conditions for the National Human Rights Commission, and establishing the Independent National Prosecuting Authority. Full and speedy alignment of the relevant laws to the new constitution is of key importance. An area of continued concern is freedom of assembly and association, and as well as the civil society space, including in preparing for the 2018 elections. Denmark therefore recommends that the government of Zimbabwe guarantees freedom of assembly and association, including through immediate alignment of national legislation, in particular the Public Order and Security Act, with international standards. Denmark notes with concern the absence of constitutionally aligned policy frameworks to ensure efficient and equitable performance and accountability of state justice institutions. The case monitoring systems of the Judicial Service Commissions are commendable, but absence of practical guidelines impedes efficiency and transparency and accountability. Denmark therefore recommends that Zimbabwe immediately adopts policies to guide the equitable use of the performance and accountability systems of the state justice systems. Finally, Denmark recommends that Zimbabwe intensifies efforts to ratify the Convention Against Torture. The CTI, which works through government-to-government cooperation, stands ready to explore ways to assist in this endeavor if deemed helpful. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Denmark for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We thank the delegation of Zimbabwe for presentation of Zimbabwe's national report on UPR. My delegation takes note with appreciation of the progress made by Zimbabwe in follow-up to the first cycle of UPR that includes acceptance of 130 out of 177 recommendations, their implementation and follow-up. The adoption of a new constitution with declaration of rights to strengthen the institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights is a positive development. We also welcome Zimbabwe government's decision to establish new institutions or strengthen the existing national mechanisms to protect and promote human rights. My delegation also appreciates the launch of Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation for the period 2013 to December 2018 to revive the economy and achieve sustainable economic development. In this regard, we also note the measures taken by the government to promote the rights of the children, women and persons with disabilities. Increased participation of women and persons with disabilities in socio-economic spheres is commendable. Mr. Vice President, my delegation would like to recommend A. Zimbabwe may continue to ensure the implementation of ratified human rights treaties. B. To continue implement policies for the development of its people under the SDGs, including measures taken for equal opportunities for women's participation and economic development of the country. We once again thank the delegation of Zimbabwe for a comprehensive presentation and wish them all success. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Pakistan for the statement, and the next speaker is the delegation of Uruguay.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Uruguay welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and values the efforts made in order to prepare the national report. We hope that the new 2013 constitution that has a broad approach to human rights can really improve the human rights situation for the whole of the population. We recommend that Uruguay abolish in national law the death penalty for all crimes, and establish a moratorium on executions and to commute expeditiously death penalties by prison sentences, to enforce the obligations with regards to freedom of expression and the right to information, to rescind criminal code provisions criminalizing same-sex relations between consenting adults, to promote and disseminate the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and to adopt national laws for its effective implementation, investigate threats, attacks and intimidations against human rights defenders, and offer protection to them. We also recommend that you accept, ratify or accede to, where appropriate, the Convention Against Torture. the second optional protocol of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the optional protocol of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances. Thank you very much.
I thank distinguished Delegate of Uruguay for statement, and I call on the delegation of Philippines.
President, the Philippines welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe in the presentation of its second national report. The Philippines welcomes the expansion of the Declaration of Rights in the 2013 Constitution, encompassing civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, environmental rights, and an elaboration of women's and children's rights and the rights of persons with disabilities. We note Zimbabwe's ratification of the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking in Person and its efforts to align its domestic legislations with international human rights standards. My delegation is concerned that the limited funding and restricted mandate impedes the effectiveness of Zimbabwe's Human Rights Commission to monitor children's rights and to receive, investigate, and address complaints from children in a child-sensitive manner. My delegation recommends the following. 1. Consider ratifying the ICRMW and ILO Convention 189. 2. Step up efforts towards expansion of the mandate and provision of adequate resources to the National Human Rights Institution, and 3. Sustain efforts to align domestic legal framework with international human rights standards. Finally, Mr. Vice President, we wish Zimbabwe success in the implementation of its accepted UPR recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank distinguished delegate of Philippines for the statement, and I invite delegation of Portugal to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Portugal welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and thanks it for the presentation of the National UPR report. We welcome that since its first UPR, Zimbabwe has ratified the optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, on the sale of children, child prostitution and child pornography, and on the involvement of children in armed conflict. We further welcome the establishment of a National Human Rights Institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Portugal would like to recommend Zimbabwe to establish a moratorium on the death penalty with a view to fully abolish it both in practice and in law for all cases and under all circumstances. We also recommend that Zimbabwe extends a standing invitation to the Council's special procedures. Finally, Portugal recommends Zimbabwe to ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, as well as their optional protocols, and the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank distinguished delegate of Portugal for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Republic of Korea to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Korea warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe. We note that Zimbabwe's follow-up to the previous review has brought meaningful progress in the country. In particular, we welcome the adoption of the 2013 Constitution that extensively guarantees the rule of law and human rights, as well as the implementation of the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable and Socio-Economic Transformation. In the hope that Zimbabwe continues to build on these achievements, we make the following recommendations. 1. Fully implement the 2013 Constitution, and in particular enhance operationalization of its key institutions, including the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. 2. Continue to address the marginalization and exclusion of women in the economic, social, and political spheres, with special attention paid to eliminating the harmful practice of child marriage. 3. Ensure that humanitarian agencies can operate in all parts of the country without undue restrictions. We wish Zimbabwe every success in its second review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank distinguished delegate of Republic of Korea for the statement. I
now give the floor to the Russian Federation. Mr. President, we thank the delegation of Zimbabwe for the presentation of its report. We note the work by the country's government to improve the legislative framework on human rights protection, in particular with the establishment of a commission on gender matters, on human rights, on elections, the media, and anti-corruption. We welcome the creation of the interministerial committees to combat sexual violence and trafficking in persons. In connection with the recommendation made by the Russian Federation in 2011 on improving prison conditions in Zimbabwe, we welcome the steps taken by the government to address this, including an increase in budget provision, the involvement of representatives of civil society, faith organizations and the private sector in addressing the issue. We welcome the adoption in 2013 of Zimbabwe's agenda on sustainable socio-economic transition up to 2018, which provides for a harnessing of the maximum benefit from national natural resources in order to strengthen food security, eliminate poverty, extend social coverage, and restore the infrastructure. We recommend that efforts are continued in that direction. Thank you. I thank the distinguished delegation of the Russian Federation.
Now I invite the delegation of Rwanda to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Rwanda warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. Rwanda takes note of and commends Zimbabwe's efforts to implement the recommendations of its fast cycle review under difficult economic conditions, including through the adoption of a new constitution. Rwanda further commends Zimbabwe's efforts to promote gender equality and combat sexual and gender-based violence, including through incorporating CEDAW into its domestic legislation. Rwanda welcomes Zimbabwe's review of its national gender policy and encourages it to ensure its implementation, including its call for gender-based budgeting. Rwanda has the following recommendations: that Zimbabwe consider issuing a standing invitation to the UN Human Rights Special Procedures, ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol, and ratify the second optional protocol of the ICCPR aimed at the abolition of the death penalty. We wish Zimbabwe every success in the implementation of the recommendations of this UPR. Thank you.
I
thank the distinguished delegation of Rwanda, and I give the floor to Senegal. Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and congratulates it on the presentation of its national report. Senegal notes that the progress has been made since 2011 and welcomes the multipartite composition of the steering committee on the UPR set up by the Zimbabwean government under the National Plan of Action for implementation of the recommendations, including civil society organizations. The constitutional amendments adopted by a referendum in 2013 and the relevant legislative adjustments have broadened the range of social, economic and cultural rights in Zimbabwe. Under recommendations, we suggest to Zimbabwe that it ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane or degrading punishments and treatments, and two, that it ratify the Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. In conclusion, Senegal wishes every success to Zimbabwe in the implementation of the recommendations that it has accepted and calls on the international community to provide it with support. Thank you. I thank the distinguished delegation of Senegal and I give the floor to Serbia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Serbia welcomes the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe, headed by the Honorable Vice President and Minister of Justice, and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We commend the participatory approach and consultations held with the civil society in preparing the national report, as well as the activities and institutional support for implementation of national plan for recommendations from the previous UPR cycle. We encourage Zimbabwe to continue with the aligning of its laws with the new Constitution and Declaration of Rights, with the view of incorporating the international law of human rights and the rule of law principles. Serbia welcomes the progress achieved in the area of protection of children's rights, particularly pledging against child early and false marriages. Further efforts should be invested in ensuring the non-discrimination of children in education, health and social services. We offer the following recommendations to Zimbabwe. 1. To develop a strategy or a national plan for deinstitutionalization of children from the residential care institutions to foster families. And 2. To develop a comprehensive strategy for children in street situations using a child rights approach and addressing both prevention and response. We wish Zimbabwe all success in the follow-up to its UPR process. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Serbia for the statement, and I invite the delegation of Sierra Leone to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Sierra Leone extends a cordial welcome to the Zimbabwean delegation and thanks them for their presentation. My delegation commends the government of Zimbabwe for the creation of a new constitution in 2013 following a referendum. Harmful practices such as child marriage have since been banned through a recent constitutional court ruling, and the striking out of Article 22 of the Marriage Act of Zimbabwe, which previously allowed for the marriage of minors under certain circumstances. Furthermore, even though it is under-resourced, it is noteworthy that the Zimbabwe's Human Rights Commission enjoys an A status. Recommendations: 1. Ratify the CAT, ICRMW and ICPPED. 2. Submit its long overdue reports to the relevant treaty body mechanisms. 3. Increase the age of criminal responsibility to match international standards. And 4. Cooperate with the special procedure mandate holders of the Human Rights Council by responding positively to their requests for visits. To conclude, Sierra Leone wishes the Zimbabwe every success in completing the UPR session. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Slovenia to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, we welcome the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe and appreciate its very well prepared presentation of the national report. Taking note of some of your explanations that you have provided here today, we would like to offer the following recommendations. We continue recommending to ratify the core international human rights instruments, including CAT, CRPD, all optional protocols to the CRC, the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, and first optional protocol to the ICCPR, and incorporate them into their national legislation. Recognizing the campaigns that your government is undertaking, we recommend establishing an official moratorium on executions and to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights with a view of abolishing death penalty. Furthermore, we recommend ensuring a free and compulsory primary education by implementing the Education Act. We also recommend providing access to free quality healthcare services for all children, to abolish corporal punishment in all settings, and to strengthen child protection systems in full compliance with international human rights obligations, including the implementation of national child protection programs by December 2018. We would like to commend the government of Zimbabwe for the efforts that have been made at both policy level and in practice since the last review. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Slovenia for his statement, and I invite the delegation of South Africa to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. South Africa welcomes the distinguished delegation of our neighborly and sisterly country, Zimbabwe, to this UPR session and thanks the delegation for a comprehensive presentation of its national report. South Africa commends Zimbabwe for the efforts made in developing and implementing a national plan of action to attend to the recommendation arising from its 2011 UPR. We welcome the expanded Declaration of Rights in the 2013 Constitution and the establishment of various institutions to strengthen the country's institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights, including a range of policy frameworks aimed at ensuring the realization of ESC rights. Mr. Vice President, South Africa recognizes Zimbabwe has made tremendous progress in the promotion and protection and enjoyment of these rights, despite unilateral coercive measures, especially economic sanctions that limit fiscal space and severely constrain the government's ability to implement its UPR undertakings. We believe that it is counterintuitive to expect a country to expedite implementation of its obligations while at the same time hampering its ability to do so. SA offers the following recommendations to Zimbabwe. 1, to fully incorporate CEDAW into its domestic legal system. 2, to expand the successful pre-trial diversion program for juvenile offenders from the existing 5 provinces to 10. And finally, to accelerate efforts to ensure the full operationalization of Zimbabwe Gender Commission. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for her statement, and I call on the delegation of South Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe and thank them for the presentation of the national reports. We recommend Zimbabwe to continue working with its development partners to invest in the education sector. We note that Zimbabwe accepted major recommendations of the first cycle and commend them for the progress made despite challenges facing the country because of the sanctions imposed on the nation. We recognize the cooperation of Zimbabwe with international human rights mechanism and commitment to submit its national reports to human rights treaty bodies. We appreciate Zimbabwe for ensuring accessibility of service to persons with disability. We therefore call on the international community to support Zimbabwe with financial and technical assistance to ensure promotion and protection of human rights in Zimbabwe. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of South Sudan for the statement, and I invite the delegation of Spain to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Spain welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and would like to commend Zimbabwe for progress made in the 2013 Constitution. The Constitution provides for safeguards against torture and cruel treatment. However, we recommend that Zimbabwe ratify the Convention Against Torture and ensure that torture becomes a crime under the criminal code. It's also crucial that you adopt measures to ensure that the law against domestic violence and gender equality is adopted. So we therefore recommend, number 2, that you ratify the optional protocol of the Convention on the Elimination of Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Number 3, we recommend that Zimbabwe apply effectively human rights to drinking water and sanitation as embodied in the Constitution. Number 4, Spain recommends that you decriminalize same-sex relations between consenting adults. As far as the death penalty is concerned in the country, Spain recommends, number 5, that you make progress towards the abolition of the death penalty and that you declare a de jure moratorium thereon. Finally, Spain deplores the temporary suspension of the right to demonstration recognized in Section 59 of the 2013 Constitution. Therefore, Spain recommends that, number 6, you guarantee the free exercise of that right to demonstrate. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Spain for a statement, and I invite the delegation of Sudan to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of the Sudan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe to this 26th session of the Universal Periodic Review Working Group, and thanks the Honorable Vice President and Minister for Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs of Zimbabwe for the comprehensive presentation of the national report. My delegation comments the commitment and positive engagement of Zimbabwe to the UPR process and appreciates the positive steps taken by the government of Zimbabwe since the last review in 2011 to promote and protect human rights of its citizens despite the economic challenges due to the continued imposition of economic sanctions by some Western countries, which has hampered the implementation and realization of human rights. We commend the legislative and institutional developments, such as the adoption of a new constitution in 2013, with an extensive declaration of rights, as well as the establishment of new institutions, such as the Constitutional Court and the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. Moreover, the ratification of many international human rights treaties. In conclusion, my delegation would like to present to Zimbabwe the following recommendations: to continue its efforts to implement the National Plan on Anti-Trafficking and the Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation 2013-2018. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sudan for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Swaziland.
Thank you, Vice President. Swaziland warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe, led by the Vice President, His Excellency Mnagawagwa, and thank them for presenting a very comprehensive report. My delegation commends the government of Zimbabwe for work done since their review in 2011 to strengthen and, when necessary, create the institutions to give effect to the recommendations received. The adoption of the Constitution in 2013 paved the way for the reinforcement of the institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights by establishing new institutions such as the Constitutional Court, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, and the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. is a positive development. Close to the heart of my delegation are the human rights of women and children, and in this regard, would like to congratulate the government of Zimbabwe for outlawing child marriages and also realigning inheritance laws, especially for women. We further laud the broad-based women economic empowerment framework, which is being implemented and has resulted in an increase in women's participation in economic sectors such as agriculture and mining. We applaud government's efforts to prioritize sustainable agriculture and continuously ensure that education and health ministries receive the highest budget allocation, therefore ensuring sustainable development. I thank you.
I thank distinguished representative of Swaziland for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Sweden to take the floor.
Sweden wishes to welcome the distinguished delegation and express our thanks for replying to our advanced questions. In 2013, Zimbabwe adopted a new constitution founded on the rule of law and human rights, which constituted an important development. However, the alignment of laws to the new constitution has proved slow and in parts unsystematic, impacting negatively on the realization of these rights. In light of the above, Sweden recommends to the government of Zimbabwe, 1, to ensure that violence directed against political activists, regardless of political affiliation, and human rights defenders, will not be tolerated and that perpetrators will be held accountable in accordance with the law. 2, to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture without delay. 3, to take all necessary measures, including to ensure the full operationalization of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission without delay, to ensure that women are not subjected to violence, including sexual violence. 4, to ensure that its legislation is in line with the new constitution and the rights concerning freedom of expression and freedom of media therein, including to repeal the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act and the Public Order and Security Act, and to license independent broadcasters. 5, to ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC and to accede to the APIC. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank distinguished representative of Sweden for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Switzerland to take the floor.
Monsieur le Vice-Président,
Mr. Vice President, my delegation welcomes that of Zimbabwe and thanks it for the report. Switzerland welcomes the adoption by referendum in 2013 of a new constitution with a declaration on rights which provides a solid institutional framework for promotion and protection of human rights. The new constitution must now be rapidly implemented and the rights that it guarantees must be upheld in law and practice. This need is particularly pressing given the ongoing serious violations of the rights to freedom of expression, of association and of peaceful assembly, particularly in the run-up to the 2018 elections. Switzerland recommends tangible, immediate legislative measures to ensure free, informed, safe participation of citizens in the electoral process in keeping with the Constitution and the guidelines governing democratic elections of the Southern African Development Community. The new constitution establishes a National Commission for Peace and Reconciliation, but this has not yet begun its important work. Switzerland recommends legislative measures to guarantee the independence of the Commission and ensure that it has the necessary powers and resources in order effectively to carry out its constitutional mandate. Thank you, sir. I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland and I call on the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to bid a warm welcome to the delegation of Zimbabwe and their presentation of the development of human rights in the country. In this respect, we would like to welcome the adoption of the new constitution of 2013 and the continued commitment by the government to accord the priority at the policy level to the development of human rights situation. We also welcome the second report of Zimbabwe within the framework of the UPR. We advance the following recommendations. First, to continue dialogue with all states on the basis of mutual respect, sovereignty, equality, self-determination, and the right to freely choose own political and social systems. 2. Continue develop policies aimed at promoting and protecting human rights and realizing the welfare and development for the population. 3. Strengthen the legal framework to enable Zimbabwe to defend its sovereignty and protect the human rights of the population. 4. Continue raising awareness of the social development goals and to streamline them into the public mindset. 5. Continue efforts to strengthen gender equality. 6. Continue develop policies to protect women's rights. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Syria for the statement, and I invite the delegation of Thailand to take the floor.
Welcomes the adoption of the Constitution in 2013, which is based on the principles of the rule of law and fundamental human rights. We also applaud the ratification of several human rights treaties, such as CRPD and its optional protocol, and the optional protocol to the CRC on the involvement of children in armed conflict. Thailand recommends that Zimbabwe accelerate the process of reviewing and aligning its domestic laws to the Constitution, particularly those pertaining to the prohibition of torture and the elimination of violence against women. Thailand also recommends that Zimbabwe ensure more effective enforcement of policies and legislations to address discrimination against and marginalization of women, and take measures to promote equal access for boys and girls to basic education. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Thailand for his statement, and I invite the delegation of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Macedonia welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe headed by His Excellency the Vice President, Mr. Mnagawagwa, and thanks them for the presentation of their national report for the second UPR cycle. We welcome Zimbabwe's ratification of important international documents since their first UPR in 2011, as well as continued legislative and institutional improvements at the national level to promote and protect human rights. The Republic of Macedonia commends the government's cooperation with international treaty bodies in the domain of human rights. We note with appreciation the adoption of a new constitution with an expansive declaration of rights, the strengthening of institutional frameworks for promotion and protection of human rights by either establishing new institutions or strengthening existing ones. As regards to the new 2013 constitution provisions that protect women's rights and prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender, the Republic of Macedonia is nevertheless concerned that the obstacles to the advancement of women remains in the areas of public and professional life, as well as in decision-making positions, including the judiciary, local government and the private sector. The Republic of Macedonia encourages the government of Zimbabwe to give high priority to the process of fully incorporating CEDAW into its legal framework and practice. We would like to ask the delegation of Zimbabwe the following. While noting the efforts of the government of Zimbabwe in order to prohibit torture, other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, please provide us with an update on the measures that the government has taken to ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment and its optional protocol. Despite accepting the recommendations to consider abolishing the death penalty and introducing a moratorium on executions, Zimbabwe only abolished the death sentence for women and those are...
I thank the distinguished representative of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Timor-Leste to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Timor-Leste warmly welcomes the members of the delegation of Zimbabwe and congratulates them for their participation at the 26th sessions of the UPR Working Group. Timor-Leste notes with satisfaction the legal measure taken by the government of Zimbabwe to promote and protect human rights, such as the enactment of the Sexual Offences Act, the constitutional provision establishing the age of majority at 18 years, as well as the prohibition of pledging children in marriage and on forced marriage. My delegation commends Zimbabwe for enacting the Trafficking in Person Act and for the creation of the Interministerial Task Force on Human Trafficking. We remain, however, concerned about the high prevalence of violence against women, and therefore we wish to recommend that Zimbabwe provides adequate assistance and protection to women who were victims of violence. In conclusion, Mr. President, Timor-Leste would like to add the following recommendations: that Zimbabwe ratifies the Convention Against Torture, that Zimbabwe ratifies the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and lastly, that the Zimbabwe provides training for judges and prosecutors. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Timor-Leste for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Togo.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and congratulates it on its report. The delegation of Togo thanks the government of Zimbabwe for the progress made in implementing the recommendations arising from the previous cycle of the UPR. It welcomes the participatory, inclusive approach taken by Zimbabwe to drawing up its report, which reflects its strong determination to make progress on human rights. Our delegation welcomes the adoption of the new constitution of Zimbabwe and the Human Rights Declaration, which strengthens the institutional framework for promotion and protection of human rights. We recommend to Zimbabwe, 1, to accelerate the process undertaken to align the national legislation with the new constitution. 2, to step up the national information campaigns on rights and responsibilities, and 3, to take further measures to improve citizens' access to justice. We note with satisfaction the creation of the new institutions, including the Constitutional Court, the National Authority on Prosecutions, and the Gender Equality Commission, as well as the Commission on Peace and Reconciliation. In conclusion, we wish every success to the delegation of Zimbabwe and call on the international community to provide it with support. Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of Togo for his statement, and I call on Tunisia.
We would like at the outset to welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe and thank them for presenting the report out of a commitment to cooperate with the Human Rights Council mechanisms, especially the UPR. We would like to welcome the measures taken by Zimbabwe in the field of promoting human rights, especially its ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, and the optional protocol on the rights of the child concerning children's involvement in armed conflicts. We also commend the steps it has taken to put into effect the recommendations of the previous review, and we praise the efforts exerted in the control of human trafficking by enacting the Human Trafficking Act of 2014. Moreover, we welcome the steps taken to achieve economic empowerment for women and the relevant initiatives, and we recommend that it updates its national legislation in a manner that is commensurate with the international commitments, especially when it comes to gender equality, the protection of the rights of the child, fighting domestic violence and forced marriage. And we would also like to recommend that it further enhances its role in line with the National Peace of Reconciliation Commission. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Tunisia for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We warmly welcome the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe and thank them for their substantive presentation. Turkey appreciates that Zimbabwe has always been meticulous about rights, protection and implementation of the laws regarding children, women, gender equality and persons with disabilities. We believe that the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe will continue to cooperate with relevant institutions to ensure the enhancement of human rights. Turkey is pleased to note that following its first review in 2011, Zimbabwe made improvements in its legislation in order to promote and protect human rights. In this context, we particularly welcome the adoption of the National Gender Policy, National Child Rights Policy and Zimbabwe Gender Commission Act. Furthermore, Turkey encourages the government of Zimbabwe to strengthen its efforts for the promotion and protection of women's rights in various fields. Turkey would like to recommend the following: extend a standing invitation to special procedures, continue to adopt measures to increase the rate of issuance of birth certificates, especially in rural areas and in low-income households, adopt measures to prevent and eliminate all abuses of sexual violence against girls and women, ensuring that perpetrators are effectively held to account, including with full coordination of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, sign and ratify the 2 optional protocols of ICCPR as well as CAT and OPCAT, ensure the allocation of sufficient resources to increase the quality of education, including to improve schools' infrastructure. Finally, we wish Zimbabwe every success during its second UPR. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Turkey for the statement, and I invite the delegation of Uganda to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Uganda welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe led by His Excellency the Vice President, and we thank them for the introduction to the national report. As highlighted in the report, Zimbabwe faces many challenges, from crippling economic sanctions that have restricted the flow of necessary resources for implementation of government programs. We urge for unconditional lifting of the damaging economic sanctions. We welcome the development of a national action plan on human rights, as well as the adoption of a new constitution with an expansive declaration of rights, although more work remains to be done. We note that Zimbabwe experiences significant food insecurity, but lacks capacity in the area of social protection. There are also serious structural and legislative barriers that exist for women in the labor market. Uganda makes the following recommendation. 1. Expedite the review and alignment of the national laws to the new constitution. 2. Develop an effective national strategy to address poverty, social security, and health. 3. Ensure allocation of sufficient resources for implementation of the food security policy. We wish Zimbabwe success in the review and in the implementation of the outcomes. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Recognizing the efforts made by the government of Zimbabwe since the first UPR cycle, first of all, the commendable adoption of a new constitution with an expansive declaration of rights, as well as the ratification of a number of treaties and many other steps, we have to acknowledge that many significant challenges still remain. There is credible evidence that the police and intelligence service continue to use excessive force against peaceful demonstrators, torture and other ill treatment against arrested or detainees. We note with regret that during reporting period, the Gender Commission and National Peace and Reconciliation Commission were not operational, while the Anti-Corruption Commission did not have adequate funding or technical capacity. Limited funding and a restricted mandate have impinged upon the effectiveness of the Human Rights Commission as well. Our recommendations: to cease ungrounded arrests and detentions, as well as excessive force, torture, intimidation and harassment, interference and anti-protest discrimination. To guarantee full enjoyment of the right of freedom of expression and association. To enact specific laws and policies in order to protect the human rights defenders. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Ukraine for her statement, and I call on the delegation of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The UK welcomed the 2013 Constitution, but is concerned at the lack of adherence to it and the lack of legislative alignment. Restrictions on the right to assembly, police brutality and abductions all breach the Constitution. We are concerned to note reports by the Human Rights Commission which highlight political violence and partisan distribution of food aid. We call for these concerns to be investigated and the perpetrators prosecuted. We reiterate the importance of respect for the right to shelter and property rights. Statements or legislation which call for the denial of those property rights based on racial origin are incompatible with Zimbabwe's international obligations. The United Kingdom recommends that the government of Zimbabwe fully respects the spirit and letter of the 2013 Constitution and ratifies the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Immediately publish a timeline ensuring that legislation, including the Public Order and Security Act, the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act and relevant electoral legislation will be aligned with the Constitution before the end of the 8th Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of UK for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Tanzania.
Mr. Vice President, Tanzania welcomes the entire delegation of the Republic of Tanzania to the second cycle session of the Universal Periodic Review. We welcome the initiatives undertaken by Zimbabwe in putting in place a number of legal frameworks in order to bring them in line with the relevant international conventions. We commend Zimbabwe's achievements since the first review, notably the adoption of the new constitution in 2013, establishment of Constitutional Court, and the establishment of a number of commissions. We praise government's efforts to combat corruption at all levels. We welcome Zimbabwe's ratification of a number of international instruments, including the UN Convention on the Rights of the Person with Disabilities.
We also welcome Zimbabwe's continued cooperation and engagement with human rights and regional human rights mechanisms, including timely submission of its periodic reports. My delegation takes note of the efforts by the government of Zimbabwe in revitalizing the economy, which has been hit hard from external and internal factors, including drought and climate change. We encourage the government to continue its programs and initiatives aimed at economically empowering the people and eradicating poverty. My delegation recommends Zimbabwe to continue to strengthen the efforts to fight corruption, to continue efforts in collecting taxes, to continue its efforts in combating HIV/AIDS epidemic in the country. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tanzania for your statement, and I call on the delegation of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United States welcomes the Zimbabwe delegation to the EUPR Working Group. We would like to reiterate the importance of adhering to the rights enshrined in the 2013 Constitution of Zimbabwe and that are protected under Zimbabwe's international human rights obligations. We are concerned by severe restrictions on the freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association, including the use of excessive force by police, bans on demonstrations, and government threats to crack down on activists. We remain seriously concerned by the increase of politically motivated violence, the failure of state institutions to hold security forces accountable for human rights violations against human rights defenders and perceived opponents of the ruling ZANU-PF party and against the people of Zimbabwe peacefully demonstrating for political change. The United States recommends that Zimbabwe, 1, investigate all cases of politically motivated violence, including the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of human rights defender Itse Zumaru, and ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. Repeal or significantly reform laws that may have the effect of unduly restricting freedom of expression and the rights of peaceful assembly, which include the Public Order and Security Act, the Computer Crimes and Cyber Crimes Bill, and police bans on protests. And 3, establish a credible, independent electoral commission capable of registering eligible voters on a nationwide basis ahead of the 2018 elections. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States for the statement, and I call on the delegation of Panama.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Panama extends a warm welcome to the delegation of the Republic of Zimbabwe, and we would respectfully make the following recommendations. Number 1, to make your education system inclusive for boys and girls with disabilities. Number 2, create a long-term plan to train and retain skilled health workers and to provide ongoing training for these health workers. Number 3, train judges and prosecutors on laws on violence against women, and also to provide training to police officers on the protocols to follow to assist women who are victims of violence. Mr. Vice President, we acknowledge that climate change is a threat which is an increasingly great threat for environmental rights. That is why we would encourage the state to migrate towards a greener economy, and we wish Zimbabwe every success in their second UPR cycle. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Panama for the statement, and I invite the delegation of Venezuela to take the floor.
Gracias, Vicepresidente.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of the Republic of Zimbabwe, headed by the Vice President and Justice Minister Emmerson Mnagawagwa. We are thankful to him for the presentation we've heard from him this morning. Despite the economic difficulties gripping the country because of some unilateral sanctions imposed by a number of Western countries, we value progress made in the implementation of the UPR recommendations. We value the efforts made by Zimbabwe to improve the quality of education for children in the country. With the Fund for the Development of Education, Zimbabwe provided resources for learning and has circulated science kits to more than 2,400 secondary schools. Through a program called Zim Asset, Zimbabwe has built 19,123 homes and has provided public services to 30,000 and 52 residential lands, plots, the aim being to create 300,000 homes by 2018, which is an excellent initiative. The government has provided agricultural inputs to disadvantaged homes in the context of a mechanization program for small-scale farmers. Venezuela congratulates the government of Zimbabwe and recommends that the government continue to strengthen its social programs and continue to strengthen its educational policy, which is an accurate and appropriate one. We wish you every success in this UPR cycle. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Venezuela for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Zambia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Zambia welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe to the second UPR cycle and congratulates Zimbabwe for our report. Zambia commends Zimbabwe for having made considerable strides toward the implementation of the UPR recommendations by bringing together all stakeholders to consider the recommendations and to develop the national plan of action for the implementation of these recommendations. Zambia notes in the report that the Constitution provides for an absolute prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Despite the positive constitutional provision, Zambia still feels a little bit more needs to be done in this area. Our recommendation: we recommend Zimbabwe to ratify the United Nations Convention Against Torture as well as its optional protocol. Finally, we wish Zimbabwe success in the UPR process. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Zambia for his statement. Maintenant, j'invite la délégation d'Algérie.
I now call on Algeria. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We warmly welcome the delegation of the Republic of Zimbabwe and thank it for the presentation of the national report. We commend the progress made by Zimbabwe, particularly within the context of the new constitution of 2013, which further strengthens the institutional and normative framework on human rights and creates important institutions, including the Constitutional Court and the Gender Commission. We also welcome the ratification by Zimbabwe of a number of international instruments on human rights. We commend the efforts made to protect and promote human rights, including through anti-corruption measures and measures to protect children through steps to retain in school disadvantaged children, as well as the draft national policy on the rights of the child. We encourage Zimbabwe to implement this project. Algeria makes the following recommendations. 1. Strengthen children's access to health services, particularly as regards HIV/AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis. 2. Promote the rights of persons with disabilities. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I thank the distinguished delegation of Algeria, and I call on Angola. I thank you, Mr. Vice President. Angola welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and congratulates it on the presentation of its report. Despite the unjust economic sanctions imposed by certain powers, which represent in themselves a human rights violation, because their adverse consequences are a major obstacle to the enjoyment of economic, civil and cultural rights for the population, the government of Zimbabwe has established macroeconomic measures to overcome these consequences. Angola congratulates the government of Zimbabwe on its important cooperation with the international human rights mechanisms, particularly the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the protocol to prevent trafficking in humans, and the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, as well as the adoption of the new democratic constitution. Angola recommends the following: strengthen the implementation of the Sustainable Agenda for Socioeconomic Transformation, strengthen social inclusion measures, particularly for persons with physical disabilities, take effective measures to reduce and combat malaria, HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. Angola wishes every success to Zimbabwe in the second cycle of the UPR. Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of Angola and I call on Argentina.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe and we thank Zimbabwe for the presentation of the national report. We note in particular the ratification of several international human rights instruments since the last UPR, including the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, as well as the optional protocol thereof, and we encourage the government in the context of the interministerial task force that has been put together to make progress in harmonizing domestic laws with the international obligations that it has shouldered, and to continue to accede to the outstanding human rights institution it's not party to. We also, in the context of equality between citizens and the right not to be subject to discrimination established by the Constitution of Zimbabwe, Argentina recommends that you change both laws and practice to ensure that the fundamental rights and freedoms of people from the LGBTI community are respected. Finally, with regards to the launching of the African Union campaign to get rid of child marriage and the Constitutional Court decision prohibiting child marriage, Argentina recommends that the authority strictly enforce the provisions pertaining to the minimum age for marriage and to prevent and investigate cases of forced marriage, to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice and ensure that victims are provided with care. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Argentina for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Armenia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Armenia welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and thanks for the presentation of the national report. We appreciate the efforts undertaken to implement the recommendations of Zimbabwe's first review, and that those efforts were conducted in cooperation with various stakeholders, including the civil society. We welcome the steps directed towards human rights education and awareness raising, such as the inclusion of human rights training and awareness raising as a core element in the syllabus of the law enforcement agencies. We also appreciate the measures undertaken to promote the right to education. However, we note that there still remain a number of challenges faced in the field, particularly relating to access to education. We are concerned about the high number of girls suffering sexual abuse and harassment on the way to or from school, as well as in school. We have two recommendations for Zimbabwe. First, to ratify the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, and second, to promote the right to education inter alia through combating challenges of access to school. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Armenia for the statement, and I call on the delegation of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia welcomes the delegation from the Republic of Zimbabwe. We commend Zimbabwe for holding the referendum which resulted in the adoption of the new constitution in 2013. Full implementation of the new constitution is important for the protection and promotion of human rights. Australia recommends Zimbabwe accelerate implementation of the new constitution and alignment of relevant legislation, including for the various commissions established under the constitution. We support Zimbabwe's Human Rights Commission. Australia recommends, as it has previously, Zimbabwe provide the necessary resources and technical capacity for this institution to function as provided for in the Constitution. Australia remains deeply concerned about freedom of expression and assembly. The new Constitution provides for such freedoms, but the draft Computer Crime and Cybercrime Bill and the Public Order and Security Act restrict them. Australia recommends Zimbabwe amend these legislative provisions to align with the 2013 Constitution. Australia remains concerned with the disappearance of Itai Jamara and calls for an end to the harassment and detention of parliamentarians and civil society members. We note the recent increases in politically motivated violence and continue to call for an end to such violence. Australia recommends Zimbabwe establish a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to ratifying the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Australia, and Bangladesh is next speaker on the list. Bangladesh, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bangladesh welcomes the Zimbabwe delegation and commends presentation of its national report and continued engagement with the UPR process. With the adoption of its new constitution in 2013 based on principles of rule of law and fundamental human rights, significantly, despite many challenges, Zimbabwe has moved towards implementing recommendations made during 12th UPR session. Steps like establishing Constitutional Court, National Prosecuting Authority, Gender Commission, National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, and strengthening of Zimbabwe's Human Rights Commission, Media Commission, and Electoral Commission, economic empowerment funds for SMEs are certainly praiseworthy. We encourage Zimbabwe to sustain the momentum. Mr. Vice President, we also note that challenges such as HIV/AIDS, pandemics, capacity constraints, inadequate financial support, international sanctions and food insecurity as a result of climate change prevent Zimbabwe from doing more for her vulnerable population. We therefore believe removing international restrictions would further development and support promotion and protection of all human rights, including right to development. We recommend that Zimbabwe first continues to strengthen its policies and measures for the empowerment of women, and secondly undertakes efforts as set out in SDGs, especially those related to poverty, education, health, housing, and water and sanitation. We wish Zimbabwe well. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bangladesh for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Belarus.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe and thank it for presenting its national report, which gives a detailed account of the measures taken to implement the recommendations from the first cycle of the UPR. We congratulate Zimbabwe on its adoption in 2013 of the new constitution, based on principles including the rule of law and fundamental human rights. We believe that this constitution is a basis for further improvement of the national standards on human rights. We welcome the extension of Zimbabwe's international commitments, including ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We recommend 1. Continuing to focus on issues of education to ensure inclusive, high-quality, accessible education for all. 2. Strengthening the Interministerial Committee to Combat Trafficking in Persons to provide effective protection to victims of trafficking, particularly women and children. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Belarus for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Belgium to take the floor.
Mr. President, Belgium welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and wishes the delegation every success in the exercise of its second UPR. We wish to congratulate Zimbabwe with the adoption of a new constitution founded on principles that include the rule of law and fundamental human rights. As mentioned by the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe, Belgium remains concerned about the persistence of harmful laws and practices against women and children in the area of marriage and family relations. Therefore, we recommend to amend all statutory and customary law to establish the minimum age of marriage at 18 years and take concrete steps to implement this legislation in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also recommend to amend all discriminatory provisions and administrative regulations relating to family, marriage and divorce. Belgium furthermore regrets that, contrary to the recommendations accepted by the Zimbabwe during its first UPR to abolish death penalty, the new constitution allows the adoption of laws which impose the death penalty. Therefore, we recommend to abolish death penalty in national legislation for all crimes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Belgium for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Botswana to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Botswana warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe, headed by His Honor the Vice President and Minister of Justice of the Republic. We thank the Vice President for the comprehensive report and update provided this morning. Zimbabwe accepted the bulk of the recommendations made in the first cycle of the UPR. We acknowledge Zimbabwe's commitment to the implementation of those recommendations. We applaud the ratification of a number of instruments, including the UN Protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, and the optional protocol to the CRC on the involvement of children in armed conflict. This illustrates Zimbabwe's efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights. We note with appreciation that Zimbabwe will introduce a new education curriculum as of 2017 with a view to prepare learners for participatory citizenship and sustainable development with respect to their rights, duties and responsibilities. One area of challenge relates to reports about high rates of maternal, neonatal and child mortality, as well as of stunting and malnutrition among the children under the age of 5 years. Recommendations: develop and operationalize a comprehensive strategy
on preventing maternal, neonatal and child mortality. Second, continue to strengthen implementation of laws and policies on freedom of expression and assembly. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Botswana for the statement, and I invite the delegation of Brazil to take the floor.
Brazil welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe to the UPR and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. Brazil recommends that Zimbabwe ratify the international human rights treaties to which the country is not yet a party, including CAT and its optional protocol, and the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, and take measures to prevent and combat discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, including by decriminalizing sexual relations between consenting adults of the same sex. We note with appreciation the adoption of a new constitution in May 2013 and its declaration of rights with stronger guarantees for economic, social, cultural, civil and political rights. We welcome in particular the constitutional provision for an absolute prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, in line with the recommendation made by Brazil during the first cycle of the UPR. We encourage the government of Zimbabwe to continue the process of reviewing and aligning national legislation to the 2013 Constitution and to international human rights law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Brazil for your statement, and I invite the delegation of Burundi to take the floor.
Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Burundi welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and congratulates it on its comprehensive report. My country congratulates Zimbabwe on the significant progress made since the last UPR. We note with satisfaction the strengthening of the legislative and institutional framework better to promote and protect human rights. Burundi congratulates the government of Zimbabwe on the measures taken to combat corruption in all areas of national life. We welcome Zimbabwe's policy on human rights awareness and training, as well as the efforts to incorporate human rights instruments in domestic law, which reflect the government's determination to improve the human rights situation. Justice is key to the promotion and protection of human rights, and my delegation welcomes the measures taken by Zimbabwe and the reforms carried out in the judicial sector to improve matters. While aware of the efforts already made, my country recommends to Zimbabwe that it step up its efforts to improve detention conditions in prisons and in police holding cells. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Burundi for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Canada to take the floor.
Welcome Zimbabwe's Constitutional Court ruling outlawing child marriage and increasing the legal age of marriage to 18, as well as the adoption in 2013 of a new constitution which provides for the promotion and protection of fundamental human rights. These actions must now be paired with rigorous implementation and enforcement. Canada would like to make the following 4 recommendations. 1. Ensure victims of sexual and gender-based violence have access to social and legal support, and that perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence are brought to justice. 2. Repeal the crime of sodomy as described in the Criminal Code and Reform Act 2006, and ensure same-sex conduct between consenting adults is not subject to criminal sanctions. 3. Prohibit discrimination against persons because of their real or imputed sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, and ensure adequate protection for LGBTI persons, sex workers, and other marginalized groups. And finally, 4, end human rights violations and abuses against civil society, the media, political opposition, repeal the ban on public demonstrations, and ensure individuals are able to exercise their rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, free from intimidation and harassment. In conclusion, Canada is concerned about reports of reprisals against those who have criticized the government of Zimbabwe publicly or privately. We stress the importance for the government to take measures to protect freedoms of expression. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Canada for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Chile.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Chile is grateful to Zimbabwe for the presentation of the national reports. We welcome the commitment undertaken by Zimbabwe to protect human rights pursuant to the adoption of the Constitution 2013 and the acceptance of the 2011 UPR recommendations. We encourage Zimbabwe to adopt measures in order to be able to honour those commitments. We would like to make the following recommendations. Number 1, to speed up the process to ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment and the optional protocol thereof. Number 2, to adopt urgent measures to make progress on the elimination of all forms of discrimination, stigmatization and violence against people on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity, and to promote the right of all persons by everyone in society. Number 3, to implement measures to strengthen the system to administer justice in order to ensure that people have equal access to due process and ensure that impunity is combated. Number 4, to implement measures to ensure that food aid distributed after droughts is distributed fairly and focusing especially on vulnerable people. Number 5, to adopt measures to guarantee the right of citizens to peaceful demonstration and freedom of expression. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
I thank distinguished delegate of Chile for his statement, and I now invite delegation of China to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Chairman, my delegation welcomes the active and constructive participation of Zimbabwe in the UPR. China commends the government of Zimbabwe for active efforts made to implement the recommendations accepted at the first UPR through the adoption of the national plan to ensure that happens. China welcomes the adoption by Zimbabwe of a new constitution which strengthens the legal protection for human rights for citizens and the creation of a constitutional court. Also the Gender Equality Commission, all of whom are designed to strengthen the human rights framework in the country, institutional framework. We commend Zimbabwe for a number of actions they've taken to promote economic and social development which is sustainable. We welcome what has been done to eliminate poverty and to improve food security and to strengthen infrastructure in the country and to guarantee the right to education, health and to housing. China would like to voice its concern with regard to the economic sanctions imposed by some countries which has prevented the Zimbabwean people to realize their human rights. We appeal to the international community to respect the choices in terms of development and to provide Zimbabwe constructive assistance to enable it to develop socially and economically. China would like to make 2 recommendations. Number 1, to continue efforts to promote sustainable economic and social development and to improve living standards in the country. Number 2, to further development of the education, including the improvement of access to education for people with disabilities and vulnerable people. Thank you. I thank China. I would like to call upon the Republic of Congo to take the floor. Congo, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Congo warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. My delegation notes with satisfaction the important progress made in implementation of the recommendations accepted during the last UPR in 2011. Zimbabwe has consolidated its institutional framework, codified in a new constitution which enshrines promotion and protection of human rights, national peace and reconciliation, gender equality, the creation of the Constitutional Court, and the creation of the National Human Rights Commission. We commend the ratification by Zimbabwe of international instruments on the rights of persons with disabilities, children, and on combating their involvement in armed conflict, as well as combating transnational crime. Nevertheless, my delegation wishes to recommend to Zimbabwe, 1, to accelerate the process of alignment of the national legislation with the new constitution and incorporate international commitments in domestic law. 2, to proceed to the ratification of other conventions, particularly those on prohibiting torture, on protecting the rights of migrant workers and their families, and 3, issue a standing invitation to the special procedures. Thank you.
I thank Congo for their statement. I now give the floor to the delegation of Costa Rica.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Mr. Vice President, thank you very much. We are grateful to Zimbabwe for the presentation of the national reports. We welcome the adoption of the 2013 constitution, which contemplates the principles of the rule of law and fundamental freedoms. We are concerned about the prevalence of patriarchal attitudes and stereotypes in the country that discriminate against women in all the fields. We're also worried about the persistence of practices that violate their rights and the rights of children, such as polygamy, lobola, forced marriage and early marriage, domestic violence, sexual exploitation and sexual violence, and the discrimination against people with disabilities, discrimination against LGBTI people and people affected by HIV/AIDS. We're also worried about the deprivation or lack of access to education and health services, particularly in rural areas and especially for migrant and stateless populations. We recommend, number one, that Zimbabwe ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment. Number two, to ratify the optional protocol of the CEDAW. Number three, to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. And number four, to ensure that the Human Rights Commission is given financial independence as well as independence for the mandate immunities and appointment of the members in accordance with the Paris principles. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Cuba to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We extend a warm welcome to the distinguished high-level delegation of Zimbabwe, and we're grateful to the delegation for the presentation of the national report. The inclusive process followed to put together the report and the implementation of the National Plan of Action for the implementation of the UPR are all examples which attest to this country's commitment to the Human Rights Council mechanism. Zimbabwe has worked very hard to meet human rights challenges that are worsened because of the unilateral coercive measures imposed upon the country. Despite these UCMs, the report shows that the country has made significant progress with, for example, the adoption of a new constitution which strengthens the human rights framework through the establishment of new institutions such as the Constitutional Court, the Gender Commission and the Peace Commission, and the Commission for Peace and National Reconciliation, inter alia. Respectfully, we recommend, one, that Zimbabwe scale up its effort to improve conditions in prisons and police cells in order to reduce prison overcrowding, and number two, to continue making efforts to, with the support of the international community, to ensure that universal coercive measures imposed upon the country be lifted. We wish Zimbabwe every success in their universal periodic review. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba for her statement, and I call on Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe. We appreciate the informative presentation today, including the response to some of our advanced questions. We make the following recommendations to the government of Zimbabwe. 1. Review the legislation to ensure its full compliance with the international obligations of Zimbabwe and with the country's constitution with regard to the rights to freedom of expression, association and assembly, and the elimination of discrimination against women. 2. Eliminate discrimination, stigmatization and violence against persons based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, and through public dialogue promote tolerance and culture of non-discrimination. 3. Protect civil society actors, including human rights organizations, against any harassment or persecution, including arbitrary arrest or enforced disappearance, and improve the legal framework so that it encourages and facilitates the operation of NGOs. 4. Allow before its next UPR unhindered access to the country to all special procedures of the HRC who requested a visit. And finally, ratify the Convention Against Torture. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Czech Republic for his statement, and I invite the delegation of DPRK to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. DPRK welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Zimbabwe and appreciates for its second national report. Zimbabwe has made considerable efforts for the implementation of the UPR recommendations through developing a national plan of action and strengthening the institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights as the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. We commend that Zimbabwe is fully committed and has taken many positive measures in the field of human rights despite challenges due to the continued imposition of economic sanctions by some Western countries. And in this regard, we would like to ask the delegation to elaborate the impact of economic sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights, particularly in the field of public health. My delegation wishes the government of Zimbabwe all the best and success for better promotion and protection of human rights, and recommends, 1, to take further steps to provide access to education for all children, to strengthen its efforts for realizing the full immunization in cooperation with the relevant UN agencies. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of DPRK for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Norway to take the floor.
President, Norway welcomes the presentation of the national report by the delegation of Zimbabwe and recommend that the government cooperates closely with civil society in the follow-up to this UPR. Norway notes with concern the high number of arrests of human rights defenders and peaceful protesters and continuous restrictions on the freedom of expression. We recommend that Zimbabwe takes concrete steps to create and maintain a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders. We further recommend that the Public Order and Security Act and Private Voluntary Organizations Act are reviewed and updated to be in line with international human rights standards. Norway recommends that Zimbabwe ensure that the upcoming legislation will not limit citizens' rights to engage in free and private exchange of information on social media. We recommend that Zimbabwe makes efforts to promote free and unbiased local media, including by removing restrictions on local radio broadcasts. We also recommend that steps be taken to promote economic growth with a more equitable distribution of resources to ensure social and economic rights for all. We recommend that Zimbabwe works closely with the international community in the humanitarian response to the ongoing drought and to ensure that humanitarian aid is distributed in a non-political, non-discriminatory manner. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Djibouti.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation welcomes that of Zimbabwe to this second cycle of the UPR and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. We also welcome the efforts made by Zimbabwe's government to improve the national human rights situation. Djibouti notes the measures taken since the last UPR, particularly the ratification of the optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as its optional protocol. My delegation welcomes the adoption by Zimbabwe of a new constitution based on principles that include the rule of law and fundamental human rights. My delegation wishes to make the following recommendations to Zimbabwe. 1. Ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment. 2. Ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And 3. Ratify the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. 4. Continue efforts to ensure the effective operation and full independence of the Human Rights Commission in keeping with the Paris Principles. In conclusion, we wish every success to Zimbabwe in the implementation of the recommendations arising from this review. Thank you, sir. I thank the distinguished delegation of Djibouti, and I call on Ecuador.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe in our midst this morning. We're thankful to them for the presentation of the report. We'll value the fact that they've put together a national plan of action for the implementation of the UPR recommendations, which is a tool for them to give effect to recommendations. We congratulate Zimbabwe for having ratified a number of international human rights instruments, including, inter alia, the 2 optional protocols of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. We hope, additionally, that the new 2013 Constitution, as well as the national institutions created by this body, as well as the adoption and implementation of updated laws, will all lead to the strengthening of democracy and the human rights system in Zimbabwe. Ecuador would like to venture to make the following recommendations. Number 1, to implement or to develop and implement the national gender policy in order to ensure that the principle of equal gender representation is respected. And number 2, to continue to do what needs to be done to put together a national child rights policy. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Ecuador for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
My delegation would like to warmly welcome the high-level delegation of Zimbabwe, and we would like to put forward the following recommendations. First, to pursue national efforts to align the national legislation with the new constitution. Second, to enhance the role of national authorities concerned with the promotion and respect of human rights. We acknowledge the efforts exerted by Zimbabwe to put into effect the recommendations that resulted of the first UPR cycle, which has reflected positively on the promotion of human rights. And we especially acknowledge the enactment of a constitution that safeguards a wide array of rights and freedoms and aligning national laws therewith, and also the adoption of a number of legislation that go in line with Zimbabwe's international commitments in the field of human rights. And we also commend the establishment of a number of institutional frameworks to protect these rights, including the Constitutional Court and the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. In conclusion, we wish the delegation of Zimbabwe all success. Thank you.
Thank distinguished delegate of Egypt for her statement, and I call on delegation of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia warmly welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Zimbabwe to the 26th session of the UPR Working Group. We thank the delegation for the national report and the oral update. We commend Zimbabwe for taking wider institutional infrastructure and policy measures in the promotion and protection of human rights, and we particularly note with appreciation Zimbabwe for adopting an applauded constitution in 2013, which encompasses civil and political rights, economic and social rights, women's rights, the rights of persons with disabilities, and children's rights. My delegation strongly believes that economic development is required to strengthen full enjoyment of human rights. In this regard, we welcome the government of Zimbabwe for launching sustainable socio-economic transformation plan for the period 2013-2018. My delegation would like to recommend Zimbabwe to 1. Continue efforts towards the capacity building of the national human rights institutions. 2. Continue to take agricultural productivity measures to ensure food security in the country. Finally, my delegation wishes to encourage the delegation of Zimbabwe in its engagement with the Human Rights Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Ethiopia for his statement, and I call upon the delegation of France to take the floor.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I first and foremost would like to welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe in our midst. France welcomes the measures taken by Zimbabwe since its first appearance before the UPR as far as human rights are concerned, especially the 2013 adoption of a constitution which enshrines fundamental freedoms, and also the ratification of the CRPD. France would like to make the following recommendations to Zimbabwe. Number 1, to adopt a moratorium on the death penalty is a first step towards its complete and full abolition. 2, to continue to domesticate human rights instruments to ensure that the 2013 provisions of the Constitution are compatible therewith, and to take measures to fully guarantee the right to freedom of expression and peaceful demonstration and assembly. Number 3, to take appropriate measures to ensure that the National Human Rights Commission is fully compliant with the Paris Principles. Number 4, take all institutional and administrative measures required to accede to the Convention Against Torture and the Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. Number 5, to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, signed in 1998. 6, strengthen the implementation of measures taken to fight against child labour. 7, rescind legal provisions that provide for the criminalization of LGBTI persons following the principle of non-discrimination. Thank you very much. I thank the distinguished representative of France for his statement, and I call now upon the delegation of Germany to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe to the UPR and notes with appreciation that Zimbabwe has adopted a new constitution in 2013. However, we remain concerned that many laws are not yet aligned with this new constitution, and that in practice human rights are repeatedly violated by state officials and security forces. Germany offers the following recommendations to Zimbabwe. First, as previously recommended, ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol, implement its standards into national law, and make immediate and concrete actions against the practice of torture by state officials. Second, as previously recommended, amend existing rules for the security forces, including the Public Order and Security Act, to ensure that the rights to peaceful assembly, freedom of association and freedom of press can be exercised. Third, harmonize all laws with the Constitution of 2013 and ensure that they are implemented in full accordance with human rights. Fourth, ensure adequate means, both financial and material, for the Human Rights Commission and the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission to enable them to fully and effectively fulfill their mandates. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Germany for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Ghana.
President, Ghana warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe and commends them for their all-inclusive approach in the preparation of their national report, as well as the formation of a national UPR steering committee through which the government is conducting public awareness campaigns on human rights. Ghana applauds the government and people of Zimbabwe for the adoption of the 2013 Constitution. We note that apart from its more expansive declaration of rights, the Constitution strengthened the institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights by establishing new institutions such as the Constitutional Court, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, and the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. Ghana recommends that the government of Zimbabwe endeavors to fully implement the Constitution and operationalize the key human rights promotion institutions that it establishes. Ghana also recommends the following for the consideration of Zimbabwe: strengthen efforts to increase women's access to health care facilities and medical assistance in order to address the prevailing high maternal mortality rate. Ratify the International Convention on the Rights of Migrants and Their Families, International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, and the Convention Against Torture. To submit overdue reports to the human rights treaty bodies, issue standing invitations to all special procedure mandate holders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Ghana for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Guatemala to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe and thank the delegation for the presentation of the national report. We've taken note of the efforts made to ensure that human rights are promoted and protected in the country. We recommend that Zimbabwe promptly ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol, as well as the International Convention on the Protection of All Migrant Workers and their family members, and the optional protocol of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW. We recommend also that Zimbabwe accede to and domesticate the Statute of Rome and adopt provisions to cooperate fully and properly with the International Criminal Court. We recognize the establishment of the National Human Rights Commission of Zimbabwe. However, we are concerned about reports that tell us that this commission does not have sufficient human and financial resources to fulfill its mandate. We therefore recommend that Zimbabwe guarantee the independence of the commission as far as the following are concerned: funding, mandate, immunity and appointment of its members, and all this in accordance with the Paris Principles on the National Institutions of the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. Finally, we recommend that Zimbabwe extend an open and standing invitation to mandate holders of the United Nations special procedures. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Guatemala for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Holy See.
Mr. President, the Holy See welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe on the occasion of the presentation of its second national report to the UPR. My delegation acknowledges the various efforts made by Zimbabwe to guarantee effectively the implementation of human rights through the launch of the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation, ZIM asset. We are glad to note the attention given to provide access to education for all through the non-formal education policy, as well as the enactment of the Trafficking in Persons Act and the creation of the Inter-Ministerial Task Force on Human Trafficking. My delegation would like to present the following recommendations. 1, to continue efforts to implement the ZIM asset in order to improve economic development and to enhance peace and security. 2, to continue efforts to align training programs of all government officials with international human rights law and incorporate more training in child rights in professional development courses. And 3, to reinforce policies to ensure that all children born in Zimbabwe, regardless of their parents' origins, are issued with birth certificates. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Holy See for his statement, and I invite the delegation of India to take the floor.
President, India warmly welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe. We commend Zimbabwe for the participatory approach adopted during the drafting of its national report. We note with appreciation the recent legislative measures to strengthen institutions promoting and protecting human rights, especially the expansion of the Declaration of Rights in the 2013 Constitution. Initiatives towards domestication of international human rights treaties are also commendable. We note with appreciation Zimbabwe's efforts towards viable funding for social services mechanisms despite severe economic challenges. Zimbabwe's commitment towards human rights are also reflected in public awareness campaigns, capacity building programs, human rights training of law enforcement agencies, and the new education curriculum which is to be implemented from 2017. We urge Zimbabwe to accelerate the process of reviewing and aligning its laws to the 2013 Constitution. We note with appreciation the adoption of the Gender Commission Act 2016 and request the delegation to share information on the operationalization of the Gender Commission. We request Zimbabwe to take steps towards reducing gender segregation and wage gap between men and women at the workplace. We also urge Zimbabwe to strengthen juvenile court facilities and to increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility. We request Zimbabwe to invest in the resilience of agricultural sector with the objective of ensuring food security. We wish Zimbabwe all success in its current and future endeavors. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of India for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Indonesia.
President, Indonesia welcomes the progress and commitments taken by the government of Zimbabwe since their first cycle, including the adoption of its new constitution and in aligning the new constitution with international and regional human rights instruments. We take note that the new constitution contains provisions on the absolute prohibition of torture and the right to personal security and to ensure the full implementation of migrant rights. In this regard, we recommend the government of Zimbabwe to consider the ratification of the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and also recommend the government of Zimbabwe to consider the ratification of the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Indonesia for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. At the outset, we would like to warmly welcome the delegation of Zimbabwe and appreciate their informative report. Mr. Vice President, the Islamic Republic of Iran notes with satisfaction the adoption of the new constitution in 2013, the enactment of the Trafficking in Person Act 2014, and the creation of the Inter-Ministerial Task Force on Human Trafficking. We would like to make the following recommendations to Zimbabwe. First, to speed up the process of reviewing and aligning the laws to the Constitution. Second, to continue its efforts in human rights training and awareness raising. Third, to continue its efforts in combating human trafficking. Fourth, to accelerate activities for implementation of the Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation. Fifth, to continue its endeavors to development and poverty alleviation throughout the country. In conclusion, we wish the delegation of Zimbabwe all success. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Iran for his statement. Next on the speakers list is the delegation of Iraq.
شكرا. السيد نائب الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation welcomes that of Zimbabwe and commends the measures taken to implement the recommendations arising from the previous UPR and the adoption of the new constitution with the comprehensive Declaration on Human Rights. We wish to make the following recommendation to continue the program to strengthen primary education and provide for school attendance by children deprived of education in primary and secondary. We wish every success to Zimbabwe. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Iraq for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland thanks the delegation of Zimbabwe for its comprehensive presentation. We welcome the steps taken to strengthen the protection and promotion of human rights, including the adoption of the new constitution that provides for a declaration of rights. We encourage the acceleration of the current process to align existing legislation with the constitution. Ireland is concerned by the high rate of child marriage in Zimbabwe and the devastating impact this practice has, not only on women and girls, but also on their families and communities in Zimbabwe. We welcome the Constitutional Court's ruling in January 2016, which declared the practice of child marriage to be unconstitutional. Ireland recommends that all statutory and customary laws be amended as soon as possible to establish the minimum age of marriage at 18 years, and that a comprehensive national plan of action be created and implemented to combat the practice of child marriage and its root causes. Ireland notes with great concern the restrictions on the activities of civil society organisations and human rights defenders. We recommend that the protections guaranteed by the Constitution be implemented, that a safe and enabling environment for civil society be created in law and practice, and that the government facilitate a visit by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Ireland for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Italy to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome and thank the distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe for its national report and today's presentation. Italy welcomes the reviewed national gender policy as a step forward towards international human rights standards. We recommend to enhance efforts to promote gender equality and combat all forms of discrimination, including those on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. We took note of the draft national child rights policy, and we recommend to fully implement the constitutional provision for the protection of the rights of the child in line with international standards, also in order to further reduce the practice of child, early and forced marriages. Italy attaches great importance to fundamental freedoms and recommends to review existing legislation in order to enhance the exercise of the freedom of assembly and of the press. Finally, considering that the Constitution of Zimbabwe provides for an absolute prohibition of torture, Italy recommends to sign and ratify the Convention Against Torture, as well as to consider ratifying the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We wish you Zimbabwe a successful UPR. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Italy for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Japan to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Japan welcomes the progress made by Zimbabwe toward protection of human rights through revision of domestic laws since the adoption of new constitution, and urges the government to take measures to strengthen the rule of law. Japan expects Zimbabwe to steadily implement the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation. We welcome the constitutional provision establishing the age of majority at 18 years and the prohibition on pledging children in marriage and on forced marriage. Japan recommends that the government act swiftly to address the issue of discrimination against girls in education, especially sexual abuse and harassment of girls in schools, as well as difficulties faced by children in rural areas in accessing education. Japan expects Zimbabwe to promptly amend laws to ensure the rights of children, including amendments to increase the minimum working age. Japan expects to see progress in the investigation into the March 2015 disappearance of a human rights defender. Japan recommends that Zimbabwe proceed with the early conclusion of the ICCPED and CAT and issue standing invitations to the special procedures for their country visits. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Japan for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Kenya.
Mr. Vice President, thank you. Kenya warmly welcomes the Honorable Vice President and Minister for Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs and the delegation of Zimbabwe to the UPR review. We thank them for their report. Kenya recommends to Zimbabwe the following. 1. Eliminate all barriers to students' access to education in all provinces. 2. Increase prompt access to birth registration and public awareness for the same. 3. Upgrade primary and secondary health care infrastructure. Increase budgetary allocation to Ministry of Health and Child Care in line with regional and international obligations. And 4. Ratify UN Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol and domesticate it in line with their new constitution. Kenya commends Zimbabwe for efforts already taken in implementation of the recommendations of its first review of UPR. Their engagement with the human rights mechanisms such as the Office of the High Commissioner is a positive step in the right direction to improve human rights in their country. We encourage Zimbabwe to maintain its approach as they implement the outcome of this review. We wish them the very best. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Kenya for his statement, and I invite the delegation of Libya to take the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. نرحب بالوفد الموقر لجمهورية زيمبابوي ونشكرهم على المشاركة الفعالة في عملية استعراض الدور الشامل، الأمر الذي يعكس الرغبة في التفاعل الإيجابي مع آليات استعراض الدور الشامل. ونثني على الجهود التي بذلتها زيمبابوي في تنفيذ العديد من التوصيات التي قبلتها خلال الجولة الأولى من الاستعراض في سياق تعزيز احترام حقوق الإنسان وسيادة القانون. ونثني على بعض التطورات في مجال تحسين كفاءة المحاكم وأدائها، وخاصة إنشاء محكمة دستورية وفصل النيابة العامة عن هيئة الادعاء الوطني. ونوصي بمواصلة الجهود بشأن تعزيز قدرات موظفي إنفاذ القانون في ميدان سيادة القانون وحقوق الإنسان من خلال زيادة أنشطة التدريب. وفي الختام نتمنى لجمهورية زيمبابوي التوفيق والنجاح في جهودها في ميدان حقوق الإنسان. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Je remercie le distingué représentant pour sa déclaration.
I thank Libya and I call on Madagascar.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madagascar welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe and congratulates it on the presentation of its report, which emphasizes the progress made since the last UPR in 2011. While commending the ratification by Zimbabwe of several international human rights instruments, we welcome in particular the adoption of the new Constitution of 2013, which strengthens guarantees on civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, and we encourage Zimbabwe to continue its efforts towards this. We recommend to Zimbabwe that it issue a standing invitation to all mandate holders under the special procedures. That's 1. 2, to develop a national plan of action in order to stem the rise in the practice of child marriage. And 3, to establish child protection systems in order to reduce the number of cases of maltreatment of children. We wish every success to Zimbabwe in this cycle. Thank you. I thank the distinguished delegate of Madagascar and I call on the Maldives.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Maldives welcomes the delegation from Zimbabwe to this review. We appreciate today's presentation and commend Zimbabwe for its constructive engagement with the UPR process. We welcome Zimbabwe's adoption of a new constitution in May of 2013. Founded on basic principles of human rights and the rule of law. The Maldives recommends to the government of Zimbabwe to 1. Continue taking measures to integrate international human rights laws and standards for treaties it's a party to into the framework of its domestic law. 2. Continue taking legislative action to eliminate the marginalization of women from socioeconomic and political spheres and strengthen mechanisms for protection against gender-based violence. 3. Continue efforts to combat diseases including malaria and HIV/AIDS by investing in pharmaceutical research and public access to treatment options. My delegation wishes Zimbabwe success at this UPR review process. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Maldives for his statement and I call on the delegation of Mauritius.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Mauritius delegation thanks the Honorable Vice President and Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs of the Republic of Zimbabwe for the detailed presentation on Zimbabwe's UPR report. We acknowledge the achievements and progress made by Zimbabwe in the promotion of human rights since the last UPR review in 2011. We wish to commend the efforts of the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe for the notable progress made toward the implementation of the UPR recommendations, in particular through the development of the National Plan of Action. The adoption of the new Zimbabwean constitution with an expanded Declaration of Rights in 2013 has consolidated the institutional framework for the protection and promotion of civil and political rights, human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. We welcome the achievements of Zimbabwe with regard to human rights, such as the implementations of the broad-based economic empowerment framework designed to increase the participation of women in the Zimbabwean economy and the efforts in combating gender-based violence. We note the commitment of the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe in guaranteeing the right of education through measures such as the Basic Education Assistance Module and the Non-Formal Education Policy. Finally, Mauritius notes that Zimbabwe has ratified several human rights treaties since the previous UPR review and recommends that the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe continue the positive work on the domestication of human rights treaties as indicated in the midterm report. We wish the delegation of Zimbabwe a successive review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Mauritius for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Mexico.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mexico welcomes the delegation of Zimbabwe in this UPR and invites Zimbabwe to continue to making institutional efforts to increase cooperation with the Human Rights Council Special Procedures and cooperation also with the treaty bodies. We would like to welcome the fact that the new constitution sets the age for majority at 18. In a respectful and in a constructive spirit, Mexico recommends that Zimbabwe set up a strategy to promote the rights of women, to combat discrimination against women and girls, focusing in particular on matters such as early or forced marriage, sexual violence, equal access to education, and equal access to land ownership inter alia. Number 2, to scale up efforts to ensure that all children are issued with a birth certificate. And number 3, to continue to ensure through an ongoing campaign or strategy access to food and to education for all children, including children with disabilities, children who live or work in the street, orphans and children living in rural areas. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Mexico for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Montenegro.
Montenegro warmly welcomes distinguished delegation of Zimbabwe. Montenegro welcomes commitment of the government of Zimbabwe to the promotion and protection of human rights, capacity building and enhancing cooperation with the NGOs, community and religious leaders in this field. We commend efforts to provide same opportunities for boys and girls to obtain education, in particular to encourage girls to proceed to upper levels, as well as activities toward promoting all-inclusive school system for persons with disabilities. We emphasize the adoption of the strategy of child protection and social system and efforts to ensure the registration of children at birth. In regards to the activities to combat violence and discrimination against women, we noted concerns of the CEDAW committee related to domestic and sexual violence. We would like to ask the delegation to elaborate on activities undertaken to investigate all such cases, bring perpetrators to justice and to provide protection and assistance to victims of violence. Montenegro makes following recommendations: to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR aimed at the abolition of the death penalty, and to ratify Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Montenegro for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Morocco.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I thank Emmerson Mnagawagwa, Vice President and Minister for Justice and Legal and Parliamentary Affairs of Zimbabwe, for his presentation of the national report. Morocco commends the efforts made by Zimbabwe to implement the recommendations arising during the previous cycle of the UPR, and in particular welcomes the adoption in 2013 of a new constitution, strengthening the normative and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights. We note with satisfaction the efforts made by Zimbabwe to promote and protect human rights. reflected by the ratification of several conventions, including that on the rights of persons with disabilities, the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and the optional protocol on the sale of children. Morocco recommends to the brother country of Zimbabwe, 1, to strengthen national mechanisms to allow children's access to education and health services, particularly in rural areas, and 2, to support partnerships, particularly with the private sector, for the implementation of the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Development. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Morocco for his statement, and I call on the delegation of Mozambique.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We warmly welcome His Excellency Mnanga and his delegation to this Universal Periodic Review. We welcome the report which outlines the actions undertaken by Zimbabwe in the implementation of accepted recommendations from the previous UPR cycle. On economic, social and cultural rights, we take note of the launch of the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation based on strategic clusters for the period 2013-2018, which aims to revive the economic in the efforts of achieving sustainable economic development, taking advantage of the country's human and natural resources. We also welcome the key national priorities, initiatives, and comments that Zimbabwe has been undertaking to address challenges and improve human rights situations on the ground, as articulated in Chapter 6 of the report. In this context, we encourage Zimbabwe to continue its engagement with key international and multilateral institutions so that they can resume support for the country, in the absence of which Zimbabwe would hardly be able to continue countering the human rights of its people. Mozambique joins those who have appealed for the lifting of economic sanctions on Zimbabwe in the interest of...
I thank the distinguished delegate of Zimbabwe for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Myanmar to take the floor.
Vice President, my delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Zimbabwe. We thank them for its presentation and the national report. We acknowledge the positive steps taken by the government of Zimbabwe to improve the better assurance of economic, social and cultural rights for its citizens, particularly to promote the quality of healthcare service. We also take note the government efforts to develop a network of rehabilitation services throughout the country. Along this line, my delegation recommends that Zimbabwe continue to take further measures to enhance the healthcare services, especially for women and children. In conclusion, we wish the delegation of Zimbabwe a successful UPR, and thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Myanmar for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Namibia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Namibia warmly welcomes the high-level delegation of Zimbabwe, our neighbor and fellow SADC member, and commends them on the presentation of the national report and the transparent and inclusive manner in which the government of Zimbabwe prepared for this review. Namibia expresses its solidarity with Zimbabwe on overcoming the challenges experienced in our sub-region because of the relentless drought we currently experience. We are pleased to take note of the enactment of various legislation since the last review, which promote and protect the rights of Zimbabweans and which operationalize and strengthen institutions established by the Constitution that contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights. We encourage the government of Zimbabwe to continue with its commitment to ensure that the organ on national healing and reconciliation and integration fully implements its mandate, and to ensure that the constitutionally created National Peace and Reconciliation Commission is effective and independent in its functions. Namibia recommends 1. That Zimbabwe considers accession to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment. 2. That Zimbabwe considers amending the existing legislation to ensure that all children born in Zimbabwe, regardless of the parents' origin, are issued with birth certificates, and to ensure the paternity rights of children born out of wedlock. 3, that Zimbabwe continues to take measures to ensure freedom of the media and press freedom. We wish Zimbabwe well.
I thank distinguished representative of Namibia for her statement, and the last speaker on the list is delegation of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Israel thanks Zimbabwe for the report presented before us today. During the last cycle, Zimbabwe accepted recommendations related to the ratification of the CAT, but it has not done it so far. Moreover, Israel is concerned for the many overdue reports to different human rights monitoring mechanisms. Israel hopes that Zimbabwe will comply soon with these commitments. Mr. Vice President, Israel would like to recommend Zimbabwe the following: to adopt measures to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls, especially the adoption of legislation, the establishment of more shelters, and the training for judges, prosecutors, and police officers. To improve the protection of children, taking measures to prevent forced and early marriage, and to eliminate child labor. To adopt measures to prevent discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity, both by state officials and non-state actors, and to allow the change of gender markers on government-issued documentation. To align domestic legislation with obligations under the CRPD, and to adopt measures to ensure inclusive education and access to public buildings to people with disabilities. And lastly, to provide training to judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, border guards, and social workers in identifying and dealing with victims of trafficking and in the anti-trafficking legislation. I thank you.
I thank distinguished delegate of Israel for his statement. And Israel was the last speaker on the list in this interactive dialogue. Now it is my duty to turn to delegation of Zimbabwe to answer questions, and to His Excellency Mr. Emmerson Mnagawagwa to make final remarks. You have heard 86 delegations, and you have 23 minutes, more precisely 23 minutes, 38 seconds to make your statement and reply to questions. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We acknowledge the various questions from distinguished delegates. Most of the concerns raised have been addressed in my opening statement. However, my officials on my delegation will respond to some of these issues. The Permanent Secretary and the Minister of Justice will deal with the state party reports, and Secretary for Education will deal with compulsory education, and the Secretary for Women Affairs will deal with issues pertaining to women participation in the economic and the social spheres, while water and sanitation, my ambassador will deal with that. But I would like just to comment that on the issue raised by the DPRK, who raised a question on how the Western imposed sanctions affect public health delivery in Zimbabwe. In response to that, yes, there has been a general decline in the area of health service deliveries in all the centers, especially a decline in maternal child nutrition due to lack of funding in that sector. Obviously, also in various sectors of the economy, as a result of the slowdown of our economy resulting from the imposed sanctions, we have had a brain drain which has affected service delivery in the country. I would like now to call upon the Secretary for Justice to attend to the sector I have allocated here.
Thank you, Mr. President. Zimbabwe acknowledges the question from the distinguished delegate of Sierra Leone regarding outstanding state party reports by the government of Zimbabwe. I wish to respond that government is mindful of its obligation to timelessly submit state party reports. As such, government is working towards ensuring that we are up to date with state party reporting. To that end, Cabinet has established an interministerial committee on human rights and humanitarian law, which we call the IMC, which is tasked with the drafting of state party reports. To date, we have compiled a number of reports which will be submitted in due course. And these are the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, including the Women's Rights Protocol, the International Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the UNCRPD, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All these are going to be submitted in due course. I thank you, Mr. President.
May I now call Secretary to deal with the issue of free and compulsory education.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I wish to acknowledge the question from the distinguished delegates from Slovenia on the issue of free basic education. Zimbabwe is committed to fulfilling its obligations in terms of Section 75 of the Constitution within the limits of available resources. It is the state's position that this right will be progressively achieved as resources become available. While resources are limited because of the constrained fiscal space, parents are requested to assist within their means so that children are not disadvantaged. Government is implementing measures to contain the cost drivers in education by regulating the fees charged so that they are maintained at the lowest affordable levels. Government has put in place measures to ensure that no child of school-going age is deprived of the right to education as a result of parents' or guardians' failure to pay fees. The position is that no child should be barred from attending school because of non-payment of fees or levies by parents or guardians. In addition, government, through its own resources and with assistance from development partners, provides funding under the Basic Education Assistance Module to cater for school fees requirements for children from vulnerable families. Zimbabwe's literacy rate of 92%, which is the highest in Africa, is testimony to the quality of its education. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. May I now call upon the Permanent Secretary for Women Affairs, who shall respond to the issue of women participation in the economic and the social spheres in Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome and take note of the comments made by distinguished delegates. As highlighted by the head of delegation and Honorable Vice President Mnangagwa, Zimbabwe remains very committed to the economic and social empowerment of women and girls, particularly as it relates to access to productive resources, especially access to finance. To this end, the government of Zimbabwe established the Women's Development Fund in 2010 to enable women from both rural and urban areas to access funds without collateral. Government has also started the process of setting up a women's microfinance bank, and this bank will enable women, again from both rural and urban areas, to access finances without collateral. Women are also going to undergo training in financial literacy so that they can enhance their entrepreneurship skills. Government has developed a very comprehensive financial inclusion strategy which will ensure that financial institutions develop products which take into cognizance women's needs. The issue of child marriages, the Gender Commission and child marriages has been adequately covered by the head of delegation. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. May I now move on to call upon my ambassador to deal with issues raised relating to water and sanitation.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I thank the distinguished delegates of Spain and Bangladesh for their recommendations and questions on issues of water and sanitation. A national policy on domestic water supply and sanitation was launched in 2013 to guide the government in the provision of adequate water and sanitation, and work is underway to assess the needs of urban areas while siting of boreholes in rural areas is in progress. Funds have also been secured to rehabilitate boreholes in 33 rural districts in 5 provinces, while funding has also been sourced for the refurbishment of sewer and water works in urban areas. 757 boreholes have so far been drilled, while 6,170 boreholes have been rehabilitated and are now functional. Funding has been secured and work is in progress for the rehabilitation of the waterworks plant in Harare. Once completed, the plant will operate at full capacity, which means the delivery of 160 megaliters per day from the current 50 megaliters. Rehabilitation of sewage works is also continuing in Harare, and funding has also been secured for the rehabilitation of water and sewer infrastructure in 14 small towns, which will positively impact on the distribution of potable water and sewer reticulation. In rural areas, investment towards universal access to safe drinking water sources continues through the drilling of new water points, rehabilitation of broken down water points. Access to adequate sanitation also continues to be improved through demand-led sanitation approaches, such as the sanitation-focused participatory health and hygiene education and the rehabilitation of sewerage systems in urban centers. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Other distinguished delegations talked about political prisoners as well as detainees in Zimbabwe. We have none. On the issue of the death penalty, may I share with you that for over a decade now, we have had no executions in Zimbabwe. Currently, we have 90 inmates under death penalty. And last week, in our cabinet, we received 10 petitions for clemency from the President, and all the 10 were granted. We then decided that I, as Vice President responsible for the administration of justice, should put a paper on the question of the abolition of death penalty, which we have to debate. Having made that comment, Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, I wish to thank all delegations that have contributed to the discussion on my country's universal periodic review today. We have intently taken note of all the views that were put forward regarding how we can improve the protection and promotion of human rights of our people, as well as fulfill our international obligations. I would like to emphasize that the government of Zimbabwe will closely scrutinize these suggestions with a view to taking them on board in our continuing national effort. This is in line with the importance that we attach to the universal and impartial nature of the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. I also wish to take this opportunity to reiterate that the government of Zimbabwe remains committed to implementing human rights for the good of our people. We are mindful of the imperative need for us to work towards the adoption of constitutional, legislative, and administrative measures that are in line with international human rights instruments and standards. Matters concerning human rights are a priority for the government of Zimbabwe, and we will continue to engage the Human Rights Council and the international community on these important issues. I thank you.
I would like to thank His Excellency, Mr. Emmerson Mnagawagwa, for his final remarks, as well as the delegation of Zimbabwe for responses to questions raised by delegations during the interactive dialogue. I would like also to remind delegations that if you wish to see your statements published on UPR extranet, please submit them in the Word format to the Secretariat. In concluding, I would like to say that the report of the review will be prepared by members of TRIO, namely representative of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Kenya, and the United Arab Emirates, in accordance with the new procedure established in 2015. The recommendation section will be distributed in afternoon of Friday, 4th of November, for adoption on the same day as of 3 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email to all delegations on Friday, 18th of November this year. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. sharp for the review of the report of Lithuania. Speaking time is established 1 minute and 50 seconds for all delegations. You are kindly invited to ensure that statements are delivered within this time limit. Inscribed speakers who wish to withdraw from the list are kindly invited to inform Secretariat not later than 30 minutes before the meeting starts. And all participants, of course, are invited to be in this very room on time. With this, I declare this meeting closed and wish all of you bon appétit.